Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. A watershed moment. EU leaders hold an emergency summit in Brussels on defence and Ukraine aid. Trump issues a last warning to Hamas to release hostages in Gaza. And UK Defence Secretary John Healey touches down in Washington for talks with his US counterpart, Pete Hegseth. To our top story, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has met with European leaders at a security summit in Brussels. The emergency talks come days after the US suspended military aid and suspended intelligence sharing. The president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, called it a watershed moment for Europe and Ukraine, adding it's so important that we do stand together. Meanwhile, Zelensky thanked Europe for its support. Let's take a look.
We are very thankful that we are not alone, and these are not just words, we feel it. It's very important. You made a strong signal to Ukrainian people, to Ukrainian warriors, to civilians, to all our families, and it's great that we are not alone. We feel it and we know it. Thank you so much for everything.
French President Emmanuel Macron was also at the summit when the Kremlin responded to comments he made yesterday about an alleged Russian threat to the European Union. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov rejected Macron's claims and called them unintelligent, baseless and extremely confrontational. Here's just what he had to say.
Of course, this is a threat to Russia. If they consider us a threat, if they call a meeting of the chiefs of general staff of European countries and Britain, if they say that it is necessary to use nuclear weapons, to prepare to use nuclear weapons against Russia, this is, of course, a threat. And with regard to these, well, frankly speaking, unintelligent accusations of Russia preparing a war against Europe and France, Putin has repeatedly spoken out, calling such thoughts delusional nonsense. Probably, for any more or less sane person, it is completely clear that Russia does not need this. We will absolutely not just calmly observe such actions, and especially against the backdrop of Macron's nervous statement yesterday that Russia is a threat to Europe, and therefore, if this is a threat, then troops must be sent against this threat.
The EU summit comes days after the US suspended military aid and intelligence sharing. To talk more about this, I'm joined by former Trump state campaign chair, Rob Artlett, who is in Washington. Rob, thank you so much for joining me. We haven't heard from President Donald Trump yet, but how do you think he will react to today's meeting between Europe and Ukraine in Brussels?
It's an honor and pleasure to be with you and your audience, and thank you for the opportunity. I would say, quite frankly, that President Trump is very focused on bringing peace between Russia and Ukraine. And I think he would welcome the conversations between the EU and Ukraine. At the end of the day, President Trump is going to do what is required from our friends and from our partners in the region to make it be known that the expectation and almost a demand is peace. Let's not forget who President Trump is. He is a deal maker. And how do you bring a deal to the table to bring peace and prosperity to the region? Well, it all begins by conversations. It all begins by understanding each other's side. It also is an understanding of transparency and accountability through this process. So make no mistake that President Trump is very focused on bringing peace and prosperity to the area and to stop and to halt the war. He has already stated that he is demanding, if you would, a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And under the previous administration, under President Biden, I would say that America was a passive supporter with a blank check. We gave billions of dollars to Ukraine without that transparency and accountability. What I believe what President Trump is doing, especially with the mineral deal between the U.S. and Ukraine, is no longer just supporting Ukraine, but being a partner with Ukraine. Big difference between the previous administration and President Trump. If we have a vested interest in Ukraine with this mineral deal, then I will tell you that the adversaries or Russia will not be invading Ukraine with Americans' presence and Americans' partnership with Ukraine. So I think it's a very vital process. And I do believe, as early as this morning, that President Zelensky has reached back to the White House, reached back to President Trump, and did apologize for what happened at the White House last week, and is ready to proceed with signing of the mineral deal between Ukraine and the U.S. government with President Trump.
Rob, today a Ukrainian ambassador has reportedly said the US has joined an axis of evil in destroying world order along with Russia. Trump hasn't reacted to this, but does insist, as you just said to me, he wants peace. Do you think his plan to achieve peace in the way that he's going about it is backfiring to some extent?
Not at all. I would say what you're seeing is it's a leader. President Trump is a leader, and he's going to demand accountability and transparency in this process. For anybody to say otherwise is just ignorant and irresponsible. Make no mistake, when President Trump was in his first term 4 years ago, there were no new wars in this world. There was no conflict between Russia and Ukraine at that time. There was no war between Hamas and Israel at that time. So President Trump is the president of peace. Make no mistake, that's who he is, that's what he is, and that's what you see in President Trump and in the White House. It's called leadership. So for anybody to say that, well, they're not paying attention, because there's been conflict and bloodshed and murders without President Trump prior to this current administration. And now that he's in office, you will see at all costs peace and prosperity. Not to mention, this is President Trump's final term. He will not be president after this current term. So I believe President Trump is also very focused on his legacy. He wants not just short-term peace, but he also is looking for long-term peace between Ukraine and Russia, as well as Hamas and the Palestine people, and that of Israel. President Trump is also thinking about his legacy. Therefore, I believe he's very focused on long-term peace, not just short-term peace.
This week, Trump has made some dramatic decisions when it does come to foreign policy. The latest is negotiating with Hamas, for example. His supporters will say, as I'm sure you agree with, it's the art of the deal and negotiating tactics. But critics really do argue he's not weighing up the risks to this type of diplomacy. What do you think of this? Do you think sort of going around the official channels that were always followed by the Biden administration is the right way to do things?
Well, let's just talk about what the Biden administration did. They did nothing other than write checks and played both sides. That's what they did. They funneled lots of money to the terrorist organization of Hamas, to the tune of $2 billion, as it was reported this last weekend here in America. So President Trump, again, is not going to give blank checks to anybody. He will seek accountability and transparency in this process. And again, what did President Biden do? Well, he created two conflicts in this world. Lots of people have been murdered. Lots of people, there was lots of bloodshed and lots of destruction under a President Biden. President Trump they can't say that about President Trump. He's here to focus on bringing peace. And you are correct. It is all about the art of the deal. And it all starts with communication. Why shouldn't Hamas and America be in communication? Why not? Why shouldn't they be in communication to learn from each other? And at the end of the day, the goal is, again, I'll say it again, the goal is peace and prosperity. And President Trump has said more than once, what does that look like specifically in Gaza? Well, he says that he would like to see America control Gaza. He also used the word ownership. So what does that really mean? I don't know. I'm not going to speak directly for President Trump, but what I do know is that America has done this before. We could look at Puerto Rico. That is a U.S. territory today. We could look at Guam, and that is also a U.S. territory today. Are those people better off today because of the American presence? I would say yes. Would the Palestine people be better off with an American presence in Gaza versus that of Hamas? Think about that for a moment. What we know about Hamas is they've brought bloodshed and murder amongst the Palestine people. Would that happen if U.S. was there as a presence, as a level of security and prosperity for the people? I would say they would be safer with an American presence in Gaza than that of a terrorist organization called Hamas.
Just very briefly, in 60 seconds or so, what are you hearing from former Republicans and Republicans, you know, who you, of course, know, on Trump's first 6 weeks in office? What's the feeling there?
It's a great question. I would say that Trump 2.0, the second administration of President Trump, is a lot more focused and a lot more resolve as far as getting things done. He knows this is his final term. He learned a lot of lessons from the first administration. He learned that you can't trust people. He was not a politician 4 years ago or 8 years ago when he was first elected in that first term. He is now, I would say, is a politician with experience and knowing who to trust and who not to trust. And I will tell you, I feel a lot more confident, as do the American people, about a second term of President Trump, because he's focused on bringing results and not just rhetoric of the media here in America and that of the Democrats. So I'm excited that President Trump is in office for a second term, and he's bringing the right people around him that are going to get things done. That's what they're focused on, is bringing results to the American people and to our friends and allies around the world.
Well, Robbie's certainly been getting things done in the first 6 weeks, hasn't he? Sorry, Rob, we're going to have to leave it there. Yeah, former Trump state campaign chair, Rob Artlett, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We can now go to our correspondent, William Denselow, who joins us from Brussels. So, William, today's meeting has been described as a watershed moment and appears to be a sign of strength from Europe and Ukraine in light of events this week. How's it going down there?
Well, spend, spend, spend was the message we've heard at the start of the summit from Mette Frederiksen, the Danish Prime Minister. That's a clear reference to this Rearm Europe plan that was presented by the European Commission a few days ago. That would free up roughly $840 billion when it comes to boosting Europe's defence capacities. That has been a central part of these discussions here at this summit in Brussels. Also very much in focus, support for Ukraine, both in the short term and the long term. We've heard from Ukraine's president, who is here at the European Council. He says that what was discussed was more in the short term ammunition for Ukraine, more air defence systems, as well as discussing things like potential accession to the European Union as well. One other thing that has been key in these negotiations, these discussions, has been Ukraine's long-term security guarantees. Things like this possibility of Europe sending peacekeepers to Ukraine should there be a peace agreement reached in the future.
Yes, absolutely, William. Spend, spend, spend has been the message. Meanwhile, as we did see earlier today, the Kremlin is very clear about its position with a tough-talking statement largely aimed at President Macron, right?
That's absolutely right. Of course, we heard in a state address on Wednesday evening Emmanuel Macron suggesting that he could include more European allies under France's nuclear deterrent, nuclear umbrella. That has irked the Kremlin. We've had a very strong response to them. There's been a little bit of reaction to that from European leaders here at this summit, likes of Lithuania and Poland describing it as an interesting proposal. The Danish Prime Minister saying that while they're not actively looking at that option, all things are at the moment on the table when it comes to boosting Ukraine and Europe's defence capabilities.
William Denselow there in Brussels for us. Thank you so much for keeping across all of that news in Brussels. Much appreciated. Let's continue with this conversation now with retired US Brigadier-General Peter Zwack. Peter, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining me. What have you made of the developments in Brussels today, and what impact will that have on the conflict in regards to Ukrainian and Russian morale?
First, good evening to you and your viewers and listeners. We are at I would submit we are in a really, really critical period as far as what I would call the orientation, the coordination of the nations of what I call the free-minded world. In watching and in the Macron's speech, pulling together the EU, NATO meetings, and the rhetoric is so high. And I think that the Russians will have constantly mentioned nuclear weapons as a threat. If this happens, that red line's crossed. We could do this and this, even very, very recently, which I think led to President Macron's statement. We are, we've emerged, we thought, from the Cold War, and the world since the end of World War II, and then 30 years later, 40 years later, the end of the Soviet Union laid out a different path. We call it the New World Order. That grates on some nations, but there was so much constructed, and to include the UN, EU, NATO, all kinds of NGOs, and that has been withering away, whether with Russian moves to emasculate that, but also, sadly, in the rhetoric of my president, my U.S. president, who seems to be untethering or trying to untether the United States and from the precepts and structures that we have thrived under since the end of the Second World War and the end of the Cold War. So this is a really, really dangerous period. Ukraine, you wouldn't have found this dialogue, this anti-Ukraine dialogue, out of our White House 8 years ago, 10 years ago. And we've been consistent throughout, and Europe has been consistent about. Remember, Europe has been scarred by the memory of the Munich Accords in 1938, where concessions were made, and Czechoslovakia was literally forced into the Nazis' arms, and the West, before the war, basically acceded to that and called it peace in our time. We want that.
Peter,
we all want that.
Peter, just quickly, I wanted to just step in there to ask you, but doesn't President Trump have a point here? We're talking about these alliances that have been in place for years, but he's been adamant, even in his first term, about Europe spending more on defence, and it's taken until now for them to announce the spending plans and to bolster the region. Do you think Europe has been relying far too much on the US?
It's a good question. It's a nuanced question. We could say that, but just remember what Europe looked like in 1946. It was prostrate. And yes, Marshall Plan and a lot of other things were built, both on the military and humanitarian side. Yes, it may have created some dependencies. But at the same point, I will submit that we, for the United States and its military allies, these things also were good for American business. And we were not totally taken advantage of. We had allies, one of the most precious things in the world. We had good commerce with a rebuilding Europe. And we had like-minded nations that had been tearing each other apart, literally twice in the 20th century. And we got to find a way to nuance and balance that structure. Basically, going all in with strong-arming Ukraine that is in a desperate fight against an aggressor that we haven't seen of the type since 1939, the Nazis and the Soviets in Poland. It would be wrong just to pull out militarily in a time of dire need for Ukraine. Yes, it'll be good we keep our links, and yes, it would be good to get some added business going, but we have to keep the bedrock of our foundations that have worked now for 80 years, which will help the peace. It will deter aggressive nations, such as Russia. If something happens to Ukraine, the whole security consciousness of Europe will be severely stressed. And I think,
Peter, I'm so sorry. We're just going to have to leave it there. But thank you so much for joining me, and all your insights were absolutely fascinating. Hope to have you back on soon. Retired US Brigadier-General Peter Zwack, thank you very much.
God bless.
Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. President Trump has said he'll temporarily pause the new 25% tariffs imposed on Canada and Mexico for car makers. The one-month exemption is for cars made in North America that comply with the continent's existing free trade agreement. And in the last hour, Trump's also said he will pause most of the tariffs he recently imposed on Mexican imports after talks with the Mexican president. New Zealand has fired its most senior envoy to the UK over remarks he made against President Trump. High Commissioner Phil Goff compared US attempts to end the Russian war in Ukraine to the 1938 Munich Agreement, which allowed Adolf Hitler to take part of Czechoslovakia. Goff also reportedly questioned Trump's understanding of history whilst he was at an event in London. His comments came after Trump paused military aid to Kyiv and after his clash with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in the Oval Office last week. South Korean fighter jets have accidentally dropped 8 bombs in a civilian area. 15 people have been injured in the incident, which took place during a live-fire military drill. The incident occurred in the city of Poncheon, near North Korea, involving the Air Force KF-16 aircraft. And in England, doctors are calling for a complete ban on hitting children. The Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health is calling on the government to amend the law, which currently allows smacking when it amounts to a reasonable punishment. There is no evidence that smacking has any positive effect on a child's well-being. The Department for Education said the government had no plans to change the law. President Trump has issued what he described as a last warning to Hamas to release hostages in Gaza. In response, Hamas accused the president of encouraging Israel to break the ceasefire deal between the two sides. In a statement on Truth Social, Trump said, "Release all of the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. This is your last warning." Hours before Trump made the threats, the White House confirmed it was holding direct talks with Hamas over the remaining hostages. We can now go live to Washington to talk to our correspondent there, Nick Harper. Nick, thank you so much for joining me. So this latest ultimatum by Trump is a dramatic shift from decades of US policy.
Well, absolutely, Leigh Ann. A complete break from long-standing norms for US policy. First, the fact that US has decided to engage directly with Hamas, because according to US policy, up until now, the US would use intermediaries to speak to groups that they have designated as terrorist organizations. And obviously, Hamas falls into that category, which is why up until now they've been using Qatar and Egypt as their intermediaries. But here we have the US directly engaging with the group, and then Donald Trump issuing this ultimatum on social media, during which he also wrote that this was your last warning, and saying if the hostages were not freed, you are dead. It echoes very much the ultimatum that he put on Hamas before his inauguration on January the 20th, at which point he told them they would be hell to pay if they didn't manage to agree some sort of deal that led to the release of the hostages. So certainly tremendous pressure here coming from the White House.
Yes, indeed. And Hamas is now accusing Trump of encouraging Israel to break the ceasefire deal. This is a pretty big accusation. We know that deal's fragile as it is, Nick.
Yeah, certainly very fragile, and it comes as no surprise that Hamas has rejected this ultimatum, instead firing back their own fiery words, saying that the US is now part of the Israeli plan to try and break up the whole ceasefire deal and stop Israel moving on to part 2 of the plan. Some of the language coming from Hamas was that Trump's repeated threats allows Netanyahu to evade the agreement and tightens the siege and starvation of our people. Remember, after the end of phase 1 on Saturday, Israel decided it would block all aid entering into Gaza. And there is this concern that we should now be into phase 2, that should be part of the negotiations that are ongoing. But here Hamas is saying that the only way to get the remaining hostages released is to continue with negotiations and to move to phase 2 of the deal.
Nick Harper in Washington, thank you so much for joining me. Let's get into this further with a former Israeli forces spokesman, Doran Spielman. Doran, thank you so much for joining me. So the US president says he'll send Israel everything it needs to finish the job. What's your reaction to President Trump's statement and his threats to Hamas?
Thank you for having me. Well, I can tell you if any country had 251 people taken hostage and 1,200 people slaughtered by an invasion from a terrorist army, they would want nothing more than to defeat that terrorist army and bring their hostages home, which is precisely what Israel has been trying to do since October 8th. And we've had ground campaigns on Gaza. We've tried to defeat Hamas. However, there have been limitations in arms that Israel's experienced. And to have the head of the most powerful country in the world recognize the absolute injustice that there are, as we're speaking, 59 people still beneath the ground, 24 of which are assumed to be alive, and say we will give you whatever means necessary to defeat these Hamas killers, it obviously falls on welcome ears in Israel. And I hope for most people around the world to understand the situation. I would hope, Leigh Ann, that we would hear other world leaders say the same thing. It seems to simply be the right decision. Defeat evil, allow Israel to bring its people home, and make Hamas leave Gaza.
By sending a so-called last warning, Hamas have actually responded and accused Trump of encouraging Israel to break the ceasefire deal. We know this is extremely fragile at the moment. What do you make of this? And is there a chance of this ceasefire breaking down and the war resuming?
We've said from the very beginning, Israel cannot live with Hamas on our border. Any deal that would leave the Hamas terror regime that has attacked and killed thousands of Israelis, that has shattered and ruined the lives of the people of Gaza and destroyed Gaza completely, not to mention diverted all of that money that came in from the Gulf states, from the United States, the UN, into tunnels underneath the ground and held that civilian population hostage. Any deal that leaves Hamas in charge is something Israel cannot live with, which I think is perfectly understandable. And of course, Israel insists on this. And therefore, at this stage of the deal, Hamas is not willing to leave the Gaza Strip, to lay down their arms. Israel has said since October 8th, all Hamas had to do was lay down their arms, give up, return our hostages, and we would never have entered the Gaza Strip. So therefore, we're at the end of phase one, heading to phase two, and there's no sign that Hamas is willing to admit what they did was wrong and to leave Gaza. Until that happens, Israel cannot agree to any situation that would keep a terror regime just a couple miles over our border.
Whilst all of this is actually happening, Israel is sending tanks into the West Bank, and this is happening for the first time in decades. What kind of message does the second phase of the ceasefire deal?
I think that Israel has been very, very clear. Israel has lived with a very complicated situation for many, many years. There are Palestinians and Jews that are living in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. When those Palestinians that are associated with Hamas cross into Israeli territory and gun down families, two young men that were driving their car that stopped at a crosswalk that were killed at point blank range, buses, 5 of which blew up just a few weeks ago, families that have been killed even this week in Haifa, in the middle of Israel, a Jewish Arab city where people were killed, soldiers run over, an old man shot. When this is what is emanating from the West Bank, I think Israel's sending a clear message. Terror will not be tolerated, and we would hope that anyone around the world that wants to understand peace and terror do not go together. In order to have peace, you must have strength to prevent terror. We can see the same thing playing itself out in many other regions of the world. Peace doesn't come by negotiating or being friendly to a terrorist who wants nothing more to kill you. You have to have, on one hand, strength, and on the other hand, hope that strength will establish a situation where ultimately, without terror, we can establish peace. But strength comes first.
Strength comes first, indeed. But President Trump has met a group of recently released hostages at the White House. 5 U.S. citizens are still being held captive by Hamas. Could a stance help or hinder the return of these hostages and the remaining hostages that have been held?
Leigh Ann, it is a great question, and I wish I had the clear answer. All of our hearts break for the people that are in Gaza, and all we want is to bring these people home. And therefore, you're asking the right question, and no one is really sure of the answer. Is it via some type of conciliation that would bring them home. Well, we've done that. We've had a ransom. The first phase was a ransom where we released back into Gaza and back into Judea and Samaria 1,000 Hamas terrorists, 350 of which carried out attacks and had blood on their hands. I mean, that is the cost of trying to bring people home. The second phase requires even more killers and murderers to be released on the street. And so obviously, in the rare chance we would get people back, you're allowing murders to go out. I think what President Trump is saying is he's clearing the table. He's saying there's a simple formula here. There's a right and there is wrong. It is wrong that Hamas invaded Israel. It is wrong that they took the hostages. And the only thing that is right is that they immediately return them and leave Gaza. It's a very simple answer, and I think that it is what needs to be listened to. Anything else is simply Israel being blackmailed by a terrorist entity so that we can try to pull whoever's left alive, and many of them have been killed, out of the dungeons of Gaza.
I just want to bring you back to another point that we were talking about earlier. And Israel has imposed a total blockade on all goods entering Gaza, demanding that Hamas release the hostages. But since the start of Israel's war on Gaza, at least 46,700 people in Gaza have been killed. This is becoming something that needs to end really quickly. And how do you think that you're going to find peace? Because this is what Donald Trump wants. He wants the killing to stop. He wants it to end quickly. Do you think that you can get to a position where you can negotiate peace?
If negotiating peace means leaving in the same brutal, murderous regime called Hamas, that is responsible for killing Israelis and responsible for those 46,000 Gazans, at least half of whom, by the way, were terrorists, then it is absolutely impossible, because all we will do is leave the same terror entity inside Gaza that will carry out the exact same acts against Israel and terrorize the same Gazan people again. There is no quick fix here. The only fix here is to uproot a problem that has metastasized over decades, that has implanted itself inside Gaza, that has brainwashed the population, has held them hostage, has created the largest underground terror network in any single place in the world, launched the deadliest attack on Israel. The only answer is going to be to uproot that cancer, remove them, and reset the entire area. Nobody wants to have to go through this, but this is what has to be done to start a new life for the Gazan people. I think President Trump is very bold and courageous for making this plan. People are afraid to make change. It's been the same plan again and again and again: appease Hamas, conciliate with Hamas. And the result is that we now have thousands of Israelis dead and thousands of Gazans dead. We have to make the difficult decision, Leigh Ann, to go in and finish the problem. And there is only one way of doing it: unconditionally destroying Hamas. If they remain in Gaza, it is a threat to Israel, it is a threat to the people of Gaza.
Doran Spielman, former Israeli forces spokesman, thank you so much for your insights this evening.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at some other stories making the headlines today. US prosecutors have charged 12 Chinese hackers over an alleged scheme that targeted dissidents in the US. The hackers, who include 2 officials, allegedly sold dissidents' data to China and targeted several US government bodies, including the Treasury. China rejected the accusations, dismissing them as groundless. Russia has appointed senior diplomat Alexander Darkiv as its ambassador to the US, filling the post that has actually been vacant since October. The US approved Darkiv's appointment during talks between US and Russian delegations in Istanbul. His appointment is the latest sign of easing tensions between the two countries as they seek to repair ties and end the war in Ukraine. Tropical cyclone Alfred has stalled off Australia's east coast as officials close airports and schools, and millions do brace for its impact. Authorities have warned of heavy rain and wind and called on residents in flood-prone areas to evacuate. The storm is predicted to make landfall near Brisbane on Saturday. The city was last hit by a cyclone back in 1974. Scientists have discovered a new part of the immune system and say it's a potential source for antibiotics. The experts' discovery focuses on proteasomes, which recycle proteins. Experiments showed they can also detect bacteria in cells and build defenses against it. The researchers in Israel say the discovery transforms our understanding of how we are protected against infections. And the UK Defence Secretary John Healey is in Washington today to talks with his US counterpart, Pete Hegseth. According to Britain's Ministry of Defence, the two are expected to discuss a peace plan for Ukraine. It follows President Trump's announcement to pause military aid to the war-torn country. Let's take a look at the top business news now. Oil prices were steady on Thursday, recovering slightly from a multi-year low. However, Brent was still below $70 a barrel as prices fall after President Donald Trump enacted tariffs on the US, Canada, Mexico, China, and also as OPEC Plus plans to raise output. Oil has stabilized after America said it will make automakers exempt from the 25% tariffs. Shares have jumped in European automakers after President Trump gave car makers a one-month reprieve from those 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Stellantis has thanked Trump for the tariff pause and is pledging more American-made cars. Beside its US plants, Stellantis operates facilities in both Mexico and also Canada. Turning to sports news now, Liverpool goalkeeper Alisson Becker put on a show that was fit for a king as his team snatched a 1-0 win away in Paris. Paris Saint-Germain weren't able to find a way past Alisson despite their 27 shots, which helped Liverpool survive the Champions League last 16 first leg on Wednesday. Harvey Elliott's strike was the only goal putting Liverpool in the driving seat for a place in the quarter-finals against either Aston Villa or Club Brugge. And the buzz around talented teenagers Mira Andreeva and Joa Finesco continue at Indian Wells. That's as some of the world's top tennis players, including Jessica Pegula, are tipping that the pair to have the major impact on the sport. 17-year-old Russian Andreeva became the youngest player to win a WTA 1000 title when she won in Dubai last month, breaking into the top 10. Brazilian Finesco, who is currently unseeded, does begin his first Indian Wells campaign against England's Jacob Fernley on Thursday. A reminder of our top stories. A watershed moment. EU leaders hold an emergency summit in Brussels on defence and also Ukraine aid. Trump issues a last warning to Hamas to release hostages in Gaza. And UK Defence Secretary John Healey touches down in Washington for talks with his US counterpart Pete Hegseth. And that's all from us on W News. Thank you so much for joining us. Riz Khan is coming up next. And of course, don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night and have a good evening.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. My guest today is someone who's turned controversial conversations on issues such as the woke culture into an art form. The renowned evolutionary behavioral scientist Dr. Gad Saad pulls no punches as he fights for what he believes should be universal truths and real freedom of speech. His best-selling book, The Parasitic Mind, explores how the human thought process can be hijacked by irrational ideas and how these parasitic beliefs shape much of modern society. Professor Saad's upcoming book is called Suicidal Empathy, exploring how excessive compassion for harmful ideologies is threatening much of Western society. Well, his impact and presence on social media has earned him the friendship and support of people such as the world's richest man.
I found him to be incredibly engaging, very, very humble, zero ego, just two guys. We literally hugged, sat there for 4 hours, completely locked in. You know, he was confiding in me in a very trusting way, in a very intimate way. So I thought he was just absolutely lovely. I mean, he is an eccentric guy, but I've got nothing but positive affection for him.
And Professor Saad has welcomed Donald Trump's second presidency as an opportunity to turn the tide on woke culture and to boost freedom of speech. I caught up with him in his hometown of Montreal in Canada for a candid conversation covering a number of controversial ideas that he's put forward. In this, the first of 2 episodes, Dr. Saad explains what he sees as the real danger of the parasitic mind, his abhorrence of what he calls social justice warriors, and how he justifies his position.
I am putting the epistemological noose around your neck. I don't have to emote louder than you. I don't have to scream louder than you. If I can have this, gargantuan triangulation of evidence, I'll let that do the talking for me.
Professor Gad Saad, technically, but Gad Saad, I'm glad you could spend some time with me for this conversation. There's so much to talk about. I guess I should start by asking, which pronouns would you prefer I use for you?
He, they.
Happy to do that. Now, you've written so many books, you've written a number of books, I should say, that really look at the human condition from a number of angles. I'm going to go through a couple of those down the road, but let's start with the parasitic mind, because that's the one that really got you out there. And having been through it, I don't know, one sense I got was that you seemed almost angry or frustrated with the way society has gone. Was it essentially a vent?
I mean, in a sense, yes, because having been in academia for for 31 years now, I always tell people I faced 2 great wars in my life. The first one was the Lebanese Civil War, growing up in Lebanon. The second one was the war on reason, on logic, on common sense, on reality that I saw on university campuses. And I just couldn't understand how supposedly intelligent people could be parasitized by such nonsense. And so it was really a result of me having stood at the top of the mountain, screaming into the wind, nobody paying attention to me. Eventually they paid attention with The Parasitic Mind.
Isn't a best-selling book in its own way an infectious idea?
It is. So in the mimetic sense, so if you remember, Richard Dawkins famously wrote a book in 1976 called The Selfish Gene. In that book, he argued that, of course, humans are a biological animal, but also a cultural animal. Our genes spread, but so do our memes, which is packets of information. So when you're reading my book, I am literally infecting your brain with my ideas.
Now, you state in the book that people should proactively judge, not just judge simply to be politically correct. Where does that leave someone like me? I'm an old school journalist, and it was kind of beaten into me years ago as I trained that I should not take a position, that I should not be involving myself in the story with adjectives or a commentary or an opinion. All that's changed now in the media, as we know, but I'm kind of stuck in that world. where does that leave me, where I don't want to be in an argument with you screaming and shouting that you're right or wrong? I just want to hear your opinions,
right,
and let people decide.
So in your case, if you're wearing your hat as a journalist, then perhaps not judging is the right ethos to invoke. But in my case, if I am a creator of truth and a defender of truth, then by definition, I have to judge, right? I mean, I belong to the society of judgment and decision-making as someone who studies psychology of decision-making. So it's perfectly natural to judge. And in the book, I talk about the fact that many people are reticent to judge because they view it as gauche. Who am I to judge? Who are we to judge? Now, that's an injunction from the New Testament, but it refers to not being a moral hypocrite, right? Don't judge others if you are committing the sin yourself. You know, people who cast stones from a glass house and so on. But that doesn't mean that we never judge. I judge those who engage in reprehensible acts. It's perfectly part of our repertoire of human behavior.
Of course, it makes it very difficult for me because I'm kind of stuck in this world where conversations like this normally would involve me trying to catch you out or, you know, trying to have a go at you. But what I want to do is really get the most out of where your mind is and how it works. And I wonder, you know, in the sense that you say in the parasitic mind that, you know, we're basically capitulating. We're surrendering our opinions to the woke culture and to political correctness. What's wrong in your mind with that particular approach of at least accepting it?
Right. So each of those parasitic ideas that I talk about in the book, and maybe it's worth that I mention what some of those ideas are.
Please.
So postmodernism is the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas because it purports that there are no universal truths. We are completely shackled by subjectivity, so to speak of an objective truth is completely nonsensical according to the postmodernists. Cultural relativism is an offshoot of that. It says, who are you to judge absolute moral truths, right? If another culture wants to cut off the clitorises of little girls, that's their business. Don't be a cultural imperialist. Social constructivism is another parasitic idea. It basically says we're not biological creatures. Everything is due to social construction. So if Bubba can bench press more than Linda, it must be because his parents taught him to play rough and tumble. It can't be because there are physiological, hormonal, morphological differences between men and women. Now, each of these parasitic ideas originally started off from a noble place. So take, for example, trans activism, right? Yes, of course, trans people should live free of bigotry. That doesn't mean in the service of that goal, we end up murdering and raping truth. So that, yes, if a 6'4", 280-pound guy decides that he's Linda tomorrow, who are you to judge whether he's not really Linda? So no, I do judge people who, in the service of an original noble goal, decide to kill truth.
You see these ideas, to explain the parasitic mind, as basically parallel to biological parasites.
Exactly. Yeah. So let me give you. Yeah.
Please,
So earlier I mentioned memes. Memes are not the same as the neuroparasitological framework that I took, and let me explain why. A meme could be positively valenced, neutral, or negatively valenced. A parasitic idea is inherently negative, right? And the reason why I chose the neuroparasites from the animal kingdom. So in nature, the field of parasitology is the study of host-parasite interaction. So for example, you could be parasitized by a tapeworm that takes over your intestinal tract. A neuroparasite is one that seeks to end up in the host's brain, altering its neuronal circuitry to suit its reproductive interest. So for example, a wood cricket abhors water. When it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs it to jump into water in order to complete its reproductive cycle. And so that was my epiphany. Aha, I will now use that framework to argue that human beings could be parasitized by actual physical brainworms, but also ideological brainworms, and hence the parasitic mind.
Why do you think humans are so vulnerable to these idea pathogens?
Well, I love that you asked it that way, because I've often been asked, is the parasitic mind something that is specific to the current period? And my answer is no. The capacity for the human mind to be parasitized is an indelible part of the architecture of the human mind. What is specific to the current period are the specific parasitic ideas that are taking over. 300 years ago, it was perfectly a good idea, if we thought that our neighbor Linda was a witch, to throw her into the body of water. And if she swims, then we know she's a witch. And if she drowns, oops, I guess we were wrong. That's a parasitic idea. Mm-hmm. So there are many reasons for that. One of which is, as I said earlier, it helps us get through difficulties in life. For example, some people argue that religion itself, Daniel Dennett, the famous evolutionary philosopher, argued that religion is akin to a parasite. So there are a wide variety of reasons why we are susceptible to this parasitic thinking.
I'll get on to religion a little bit later because it's something you touch on quite a bit. But I'm guessing from what you say, even a good leader or someone who's a great orator essentially is infecting everyone.
Well, I mean, that's Machiavelli, right? Machiavelli said it doesn't matter if the leader is truly an honest person. What matters is that you manage that. That's why when you say, for example, someone has Machiavellian intelligence, a salesperson who has high Machiavellian intelligence, what is he or she doing? They are tailoring their sales pitch as a function of the customer that they're standing next to, right? That's what a politician does. That's why when politicians are on the campaign, you always see them with a baby. Why? Because that shows that I am nurturing, I am kind, I am compassionate, right? You never see them with babies unless it's about 7 days before the election cycle. So, of course, it's all about this kind of impression management.
And I guess dating sites, the person always has a puppy.
A puppy, or I've actually joked once, but it's based on actual science. If you hold a puppy, if you hold a guitar, and you come out of a Porsche wearing a fireman uniform, sit back and enjoy the ladies.
Fair enough. You've alluded to, the issues that you are concerned with in the parasitic mind. What do you think are the three biggest risks facing us because of the parasitic mind?
And so the answer to that is also picked up in my forthcoming book called Suicidal Empathy,
We'll
touch on that. Look, it causes us to take certain public policy decisions that are deeply problematic. On a smaller scale, although an important one, it causes about 900 medals to be given. This was an actual study that commissioned by the United Nations, because people say, well, what's the big deal about this transgender thing? Well, there've been almost, and that's an underestimate, 900 medals in major competitions that have been given to biological males, and hence real biological women have lost those places on the podium. So in a small scale, you get this kind of consequence. But how about unchecked illegal immigration? What does that do to the vitality of a society? I mean, economically, it certainly doesn't help. How about if it changes the fabric of that society? How about if you let in millions of people who don't share your foundational values? You're going to irrevocably change the nature of that society. So there are a wide range of consequences, most of them negative, that come about if we allow these parasitic ideas to flourish. By the way, the perfect manifestation of someone who is both a manifestation of a parasitized mind and suicidally empathetic is our current Prime Minister.
Oh, we're here in Canada.
In Canada,
okay,
yes,
right.
Sir.
Well, we can touch on the politics in a moment. But the reason I'm asking it in this way is that you talk about, say, immigration, for example.
Sure.
It sounds like it's a broad, sweeping brush when you apply the idea to immigration. People forget the nuances. And that is that there are benefits from immigration. I mean,
of course.
In the US, they're going crazy in the agricultural sector now because they've lost all the workers. So how do you balance not overgeneralizing in such a way that it's counterproductive?
Right. It just has to be common sense, right? I'm an immigrant. So oftentimes people will write to me and say, you're such a hypocrite. You rail against open door immigration, but you're an immigrant yourself. And your buddy Elon Musk is an immigrant. So why are you railing against immigration? That's like arguing that my little cat, house cat Fido, is a feline and the lion in the jungle is a feline. Therefore, since they're both feline, you should also go to the jungle and cuddle up with the lion in the jungle. Immigration has to be pursued in such a way that it always leads to a net benefit to the host society. If that criterion is met, then come in, my brother, and let's build a more pluralistic society together. If you allow entry to millions of people who are coming in for no other reason than you being empathetic, it's not going to result in good outcomes.
One of the things you wrote in The Parasitic Mind, to quote you, is that progressivism has become the enemy of reason. And you talk about, I love this term, the land of progressive unicorn, referring to unicorns, a mythical but admired creature. Why do you feel that progressivism is the enemy as such? Isn't there room for some understanding?
Because it is always rooted in this hopeful ethos. So take, for example, social constructivism, which basically says we're born tabula rasa with equal potentiality. And the only reason that Lionel Messi became Lionel Messi or Albert Einstein became Albert Einstein is because of a particular schedule of reinforcement, some socialization. Maybe his parents hugged him a lot, or maybe they didn't hug him enough, or maybe they took him to McDonald's enough, or maybe not enough. It can't be because there is innate differences in potentiality across people. Because here what the progressives are mixing up is equality under the law with equal potentiality. Now, it's very hopeful for me to think that all of my children have the potential to become the next Lionel Messi if only I find the right schedule of hugging. But the reality is my children are unlikely to become NBA players because I'm a short Jewish guy. Okay, the genes are already working again. Now, there are some short guys that ended up in the NBA, but the statistics are against you. So me recognizing that there are certain biological realities is harder to swallow than the progressive unicornia that says, given the right schedule, we will all be beautiful. Socialism is a wonderful idea if you're 3 years old, because I teach my kindergarten kid that sharing is caring. It's inherently unfair that Elon Musk has more money than the guy who's homeless, right? Wouldn't it be better if benevolent government comes in and it creates equality? That's what Kamala Harris told us. Well, socialism and communism have been tried in endless countries. They've always failed. Why? Because unicornia is inconsistent with human nature. I'll tell you a quick quote that I think you'll love. E.O. Wilson, are you familiar with E.O. Wilson?
I don't recognize the name.
E.O. Wilson was a Harvard biologist who recently passed away, one of the great scientists of the 20th century. His specialty was social ants. He was an entomologist who studied social ants. Now, in social ant colonies, it actually is communistic. There is a reproductive queen, and then there's a bunch of worker ants and a bunch of warrior ants that are completely indistinguishable from each other. So when he was asked in an interview, Professor Wilson, what are your thoughts on communism? His answer was, great idea, wrong species, right? So what the progressives are doing, they're saying, we will impose our beautiful, rosy view of unicornia to a species that hasn't evolved to be consistent with that unicornia. So no, I think it's a bad idea to succumb to these ideas.
So essentially, it sounds like you're saying the land of progressive unicornia ignores basic science.
Exactly. It ignores the most fundamental features of our evolved human nature. Here's a great example from, so I teach at a business school. So many years ago, there was a company that decided that they wanted to break free of the antiquated notions of toxic masculinity. In what context? Romance novels are almost exclusively read by women around the world, right? I mean, literally almost exclusively. And I'm about to describe to you the exact same male protagonist that's been depicted in every romance novel ever written. You ready? He's a count. He's got some royal title. He's a neurosurgeon. He's tall. He's bold. He's aggressive. He wrestles alligators on a six-ab pack, but he could only be tamed by the love of this one woman. I just gave you the plagiarized version of every single romance novel that has ever existed. Why is that? Because women fantasize about a particular type of male archetype. It's part of their innate human nature. Now, this progressive unicornia company came along and said, we want to break free of this toxic masculinity. So they're going to come up with a guy that cries a lot, sucks his thumbs, goes in a fetal position, is pear-shaped, has a whiny voice, he's very sweet and sensitive. Guess what happened to that line? The market said, I don't want it. So you thought that you had the chutzpah to impose what you want consumers to read, and consumers said, no, no, no. I come with an endowed human nature, and I decide what I want to fantasize about. So there are real consequences to approaching political systems or consumer products with a lack of an understanding of human nature.
You reserve quite a lot of ire in your book for what you call the SJW, social justice warriors. Explain that concept.
So the social justice warrior is typically someone who is very much entrenched in sort of progressive unicornia. I even give an example of a type of social justice warrior with a spicy term. Do you know where I'm going with this? Male feminists as sneaky. Do you remember what the last part is? Sneaky effers. Sneaky. Okay. Now, that term, sneaky effer, actually comes from science. It's So in the 1970s, the official scientific term is kleptogamy, which is the stealing of mating opportunities. But the colloquial term, even within the scientific literature, is a sneaky effort. So example, you have many species where the males, there are two phenotypes of male. There's the traditional male who is, very masculine and so on. There is another type of phenotype of a male that mimics females. So when the big dominant male sees this one, it dupes him into thinking that he is a female and then goes around and surreptitiously engages in mating opportunities. So I took this principle from the animal kingdom and I argued that human male feminists, social justice warriors, are adopting the sneaky effort strategy.
Remember this now, yeah.
I'm very, very kind. I hug the trees. When I put gas into my car, I start crying because I am raping Mother Earth with the devil's juice and so on. And so I'm very kind. You could trust me, Linda. You don't have to worry about me. I'm a kind and compassionate person. I'm a sneaky effort.
How do you propose to protect those who are genuinely vulnerable? Because we can't all be that archetypal, super strong alligator wrestling type. There are those who need, to some degree, I guess, support and protection. So how does it not kind of dissolve into this, as you say, unicornia kind of perspective?
Look, I'm not suggesting that empathy is something that should be eradicated. We are a multifaceted creature, right? We can be ruthlessly violent and we can be infinitely kind and loving, right? She's not on camera right here, but my daughter is here. I would be willing to jump in front of a truck to save her life, right? So that allows me to have empathy, have love, have unlimited compassion for the right targets, right? But on the other, the problem is when you take these virtues and they misfire. So I don't know if we want to talk about suicidal empathy later, but maybe
we'll talk about it. We'll carry on.
Yeah.
Carry on.
So suicidal empathy is simply the misfiring of an otherwise adaptive emotion. So let me draw an analogy. OCD is a psychiatric disorder, right? But at its root, it is based on something that is quite evolutionarily advantageous. The idea of scanning the environment for potential threats makes perfect evolutionary sense. But for most of us, once we have tended to that threat, it then goes away. So for example, if you and I shake hands and I notice that a minute before you shook my hand, you sneezed into your hand, I might later quietly go into the bathroom and wash my hands. I wash my hands once and then I resume our interaction. The OCD sufferer will be stuck in an infinite loop for the next 8 hours, washing their hands until their skin is falling off in scalding hot water. So it is a misfiring of an otherwise adaptive process. So yes, be empathetic, be kind, be generous, be compassionate. Those are all part of the repertoire of human realities, but it has to be properly regulated.
What you refer to, though, in the parasitic mind is something that's very interesting, and I think a lot of people recognize this based on what we see in the media, and that is the faux outrage, false outrage.
Exactly. So, and here I can link it, if you like, very quickly to an evolutionary principle. So for a signal to be meaningful, it has to be costly. And let me explain what I mean by that. You take a peacock's tail, right? The peacock's tail could not have evolved via natural selection. Natural selection is the mechanism that confers survival advantage for that trait to have evolved. Well, when the peacock evolves that big tail, it is burdensome, it makes it more conspicuous to predators, it makes it more difficult to take flight. So why would evolution have resulted in the evolution of such a burdensome tail? Well, there we talk about sexual selection. Some traits evolve because they confer a reproductive advantage. So even though it is handicapping me from a survival perspective, I am communicating to the peahens, the females of that species, despite the fact that I've got this very burdensome tail, I am still here. Shouldn't you choose me as your mate? How am I going to link this to what you just asked? Putting hashtag bring the girls home, putting hashtag refugees welcome, love is love, and all the other nonsense is costless. So it's not an honest signal. It's a faux signal. Any of us can meet it. But if I speak openly in some regions of the Middle East where I know I might be taken into the back corner and a bullet is put through my head, that is a costly signal. That is true signaling and not virtue signaling.
I remember the section where you were saying basically choose me when it came to peacocks and peahens. But it made me also wonder, you use this term, it's just an aside that just occurred to me, this term testicular fortitude quite a bit in the book. And that made me think, well, what about the women?
Yes. Well, here I use it in a sort of hyperbolic sense. Right. Margaret Thatcher has more testicular fortitude than most men alive today in the West. Right. So it applies equally to both sexes. Or if I were a transgender activist, to the 680 different genders.
When it comes to making decisions, I know you say there's a danger in prioritizing feelings over facts.
Yes, sir.
But isn't part of the problem that people don't really know what the facts are anymore, that, you know, they're so busy looking for confirmation bias?
Yeah, that's true. Let me discuss first the tension between feelings and thought.
Please.
It's a false dichotomy. It's not that we are an animal of reason rather than an animal of feeling. We are both, right? The challenge is to know when to invoke the right system at the right time. So if I'm walking down in a dark alley because I'm taking a shortcut to get home, and then I notice 4 young men who are loitering, I will get a fear-based response. My heart will start racing. I will start breathing heavier. My blood pressure will go up. All of these things have triggered my emotional-based system, and it makes perfect evolutionary sense for that to have happened. On the other hand, if I'm trying to do well on a calculus exam, triggering my emotional system is not going to make me do a better job on the calculus exam. Now, I apply that example when it comes to, say, choosing our political leaders. Regrettably, most people end up invoking their affective system rather than their cognitive system. And so here I talk about, actually an expression from Arabic, says that getting drunk by simply smelling the cork of the wine bottle. Right. Because what that basically says, I don't need to actually drink the wine to get drunk. I just take a whiff and I'm already, right? So it refers to someone who has a weak cognitive constituency, right? So for example, if you ask people, why do you love Obama? Well, he's tall, he's lanky, he's got a mellifluous voice, he's got a radiant smile. It could well be that every single syllable he utters is complete rubbish, but I'm already getting drunk by his cork. On the other hand, why do you hate Donald Trump? Well, he's cantankerous, he speaks like a brawler from New York, he's not presidential. But you didn't say anything about whether you agree with his immigration policy or his fiscal policy. So the reason why I discussed that tension is because many of the problems that we face is because we trigger the wrong system at the wrong time. Regarding your issue of what do we know what is true or not? Well, one thing I could tell you is that there shouldn't be a government agency that decides for us what is true or not. I don't know if you remember, under the Biden administration, there was a woman, Nina something, that came out who was going to be the first official czar of disinformation. I mean, Orwell couldn't have come up with such a ridiculous notion. Do you remember her?
Vaguely, but I was thinking the issue is partly that with politics, the scene has become distorted anyway.
Right. Well, and look, for example, in science, once you utter the words, these 2 words, settled science, you understand nothing about science, because science deals in provisional truths. Yes, right. There is a truth, but that truth can move. What we thought was true, I mean, the Copernican revolution was about people thinking one way about the cosmos, and then Copernicus and Galileo came along and said, no, that's not how it works. So the idea that it's settled science, and therefore we need to remove your YouTube channel, we need to get you off of Twitter because you are espousing false beliefs. Is it disinformation to say that men menstruate, or is it veridical information? So this whole idea of we tell you what the facts are is a terribly Orwellian, dangerous idea.
I'll get on to how this has been affected by social media and the mainstream media as we progress. But what I was getting at also is, isn't it now that in the case with politics, it is more about smelling the cork than actually listening to what the real policy should be?
And I think there is a reason for that. Look, we face a lot of computational complexity in our everyday life, right? Imagine if I sat there aching about every single decision by looking at every single piece of information that is relevant before I decide which restaurant to go to or which car to purchase. Then I would be stuck in choice paralysis, right? So I use what are called decision rules or heuristics that allows me to cut through the clutter, right? And so, for example, when people evoke their affective system, that's a very quick shortcut, right? Because it allows me to say, look, how do I feel about Obama? He's lovely and majestic. How do I feel about Trump? He seems mean and cantankerous. Good enough, right? Because it cuts through the clutter. Now, it's a suboptimal way of making decisions, but it is a very quick way to navigate through the computational complexity.
You know, when it comes to it, in your opinion, which is more important, truth or freedom? And who wins when they clash? For example, if you have people, you know, putting out, because of free speech, putting out falsehoods, disinformation, and so on in the media?
It's very hard to put a ordinal ranking on which one requires the other in an infinite loop, right? I can't pursue truth if I don't have the freedom to pursue truth, and vice versa, right? So that's what and I'm glad you raised those two, because I'm guessing you're referring to the parasitic mind, where in chapter 1, I say that the two fundamental ideals that, you know, that inform my life are truth and freedom, right? I don't think you can have one without the other, right? I have to have the complete freedom to be able to pursue truth where it takes me, which, by the way, leads to a very dangerous idea, forbidden knowledge, which I briefly referred to in the parasitic mind, and I pick up again in suicidal empathy. Forbidden knowledge is the idea that there are some inquiries that we should refrain from pursuing because the consequences would be too great to pursue them, right? Now, and if I may, let me explain here the concept of deontological versus consequentialist ethics. Deontological ethics is absolute statements. It is never okay to lie would be a deontological statement. A consequentialist statement would be, it's okay to lie if you're trying to spare someone's feelings. And so I often joke that if you want to have a long, happy marriage,
I remember, yeah.
You're right, and your spouse says, do I look fat in those jeans? Put on your consequentialist hat and say, you've never looked more beautiful. You're lying, perhaps, but that is a consequentialist lie. For most things in life, it is perfectly reasonable for us to be consequentialists. For freedom of speech, for the pursuit of truth, for journalistic integrity, those are by definition deontological statements. So if you say, yes, pursue truth, but don't hurt people's feelings, the but there is a big problem.
Professor, from where do you get your news? How do you make sure you're getting what you would consider accurate?
Wow, what a great question. It's really a collection of stuff. Some of it TV, some of it I read, some of it is just the scrolling through X. So I don't have a single one-stop shop place. It's a bit of but what I try to do is triangulation of the veracity of information. Do you see what I mean by that?
Yeah. I always say that there's a triangle: information plus diversity leads to perspective.
Right. So, there you go.
But the thing is, are you constantly aware of the risk of an echo chamber? Constantly trying to validate your own thoughts, because you're obviously quite forceful in your thoughts. There's a risk you could always be seeking validation.
Albeit, if you, for example, will look at some of my now I have a lot of followers, so I can't give you an empirical estimate, but I can oftentimes have on my feed 2 people that just responded to something that I posted, and they couldn't be more diametrically opposed from each other. Now, I actually take that with some encouragement, meaning that if every time I post something, everybody always agreed with me, then probably I've created an echo chamber. But if, just with one post, I can have 20 people, 14 of whom agreed with me, 6 who haven't, then I think I'm building a diversified chamber.
So I used to give this example that if I covered the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and I would have people from both sides, but either way, no matter how I did the debate or the conversation, I would get viewer feedback saying, oh, you're so pro-Palestinian, for the same show where they said you're so pro-Israeli. And my producer would say, how can that be? I said, well, my explanation was people bring their own baggage.
Exactly.
When they're watching. And that's why I ask in your case how you kind of put your mind outside that potential echo chamber.
Well, so I'll give you an example of confirmation bias that my former doctoral supervisor had told me many years ago. So he had been hired to help some company. He's a cognitive psychologist and consumer specialist at Cornell. He just recently retired, by the way. So he had been hired by a company where half the executives seemed to be for a product launch and the other half seemed to be deadly set against the product launch. And so what was going to break the tie is they were going to bring a bunch of them, put them in a focus group, and then based on that interaction, either one side would win or one side or the other side would win. After that interaction happened, then you polled both sides. Both sides said, you see, we won. Now, how could it be? How could it be that they both saw the exact same interaction and arrived at exactly the opposite confirmation, right? Well, it's exactly to your point, which is I only look for information that supports my position, and I filter out perceptually and cognitively any information that doesn't agree with my position, and therefore I solidify my anchored position. I was recently asked on a show by a British psychiatrist, this was about a year ago, at the end of the show, maybe the best question I've ever been asked, maybe you'll beat it on this show. He said, what is the singular phenomenon that you've seen in the human condition in your 30 plus years as a professor that has most surprised you? So I had to pause for a second. And then I said, the inability for most people to change their anchored positions, irrespective of the amount of conflicting evidence that they might be shown, which itself, and that's why, by the way, in chapter 7 of The Parasitic Mind, I try to offer a means by which we can break through that resistance. I talk about nomological networks of cumulative evidence, which we could talk about. So I'm mindful of even my capacity to succumb to this kind of echo chamber. That's why I try to sample from many different sources.
How do you regard conspiracy theories? The moon landing wasn't real, or that there were chips in vaccines during COVID, these kind of things that are out there. How do you regard them?
I apply the scientific method, right? So I think there is now enough evidence that the Holocaust did happen. So if you're a Holocaust denier who argues that it was all Hollywood made and there were no ovens and so on, I don't have to take it seriously, because I know the accumulation of evidence has already established that thing happened. And so you just apply the scientific method as you navigate between what is true or false. There's no other way to do it.
It's difficult, though, with things like the moon landing. It doesn't have the same empirical basis as the Holocaust, for example.
That is true. That is true. But by the way, I don't know if it's the right time to do it, but maybe it is. Do you want me to talk about how you do the nomological networks?
Please do, yeah.
So in a sense, it speaks to your general question. How do you seek truth? How do you know what's true, what's not true? And so in chapter 7, the chapter's titled How to Seek Truth, I argue that there is an incredibly powerful, albeit very cognitively taxing, method to try to decide whether something is true or not. So let's take, for example, I give several examples in the chapter, but I'll discuss one here. Let's suppose I wanted to counter the idea that social constructivists offer that toy preferences are sex-specific due to socialization. Meaning it's because mommy taught Linda to play with the doll and taught Bobby to play with the truck. That's why they have those preferences. Let's suppose I wanted to demonstrate to you that that's not true. There are universal biological and evolutionary based reasons for those sex-specific toy preferences. How would I go about doing that? So I'm going to build a nomological network of cumulative evidence, meaning I'm going to get you data from across cultures, across time periods, across species, across methodologies, that will triangulate to demonstrate that this position is unassailable. So, and I'll give a few examples. Well, from developmental psychology, we know that young infants who are too young to yet be socialized, by definition, they don't have the cognitive apparatus to be socialized, already exhibit those sex-specific toy preferences. So that already takes out the socialization argument. I can get you data from vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees showing that they have the same sex-specific toy preferences. I can get you data from sub-Saharan Africa, where cultures that are very non-Western, they exhibit the same sex-specific toy preferences. I could go back 2,500 years ago, showing you that in ancient Rome and ancient Greece, on funerary monuments, little boys and girls are depicted playing with exactly the same types of toys as we have today. So look how I am putting the epistemological noose around your neck. I don't have to emote louder than you. I don't have to scream louder than you. If I can have this, gargantuan triangulation of evidence, I'll let that do the talking for me. And so that's why, by the way, I'm epistemologically quite humble in that I know what I know, and I know what I don't know. That's why I never get caught in interviews. I give thousands of interviews because I'll never try to wing it. If you ask me a question that I think that I haven't done the requisite nomological network for, I'll say, hey, Riz, that's a great question. It's above my pay grade. I don't know. But if I know, good luck to you if you want to debate me.
Fair enough. No, because a lot of people obviously want to try to catch you out. But if you know your stuff, that's obviously going to be important. But it was interesting because you did say people who spew falsehoods should be judged. Now that stuck with me with parasitic.
Judged, that doesn't mean imprisoned.
No, I didn't. I realized what you meant. It was the whole chapter on us taking a position and so on, which is why I started asking you about my situation as a journalist. Because of course, as a human being, I have in my head judgments and opinions, but I really, difficult as it is, I enforce them in terms of my journalistic work. I want to stand away and hear the story. So many people say that politicians in general happily lie. And in the case of Donald Trump, who I know you do like as a politician, he regularly is accused of lying, and people actually metrically record this. How do you reconcile your belief then about his veracity with that documentation?
So there are lies and then there are lies. So Donald Trump lies about, I've got the biggest in the world. I'm the greatest lover in the history of humanity. The biggest audience was ever at my inauguration, right? They're ego defensive lies, right? So is he fibbing? Undoubtedly. That is a very different lie than if you are a postmodernist saying that there are no objective truths. That eradicates the possibility of truth being. And it's that allows them to say slavery is freedom, war is peace, men are women. So lies don't all come in the same final shape, right? Is he lying in the sense that he's constantly trying to protect his ego because he's a benign narcissist? Yes. But there are guys on the progressive side that are lying. If you say, for example, that socialism is the means by which people are most likely to flourish, that is a much more consequential lie than I am the best lover of all time. Both are lies. One is much bigger than the other.
But he does have those consequential ones too. They're eating the cats and dogs in Springfield, Illinois, and so on. People react to this.
Yeah, okay. In that case, I think it's the fog of the rapidity of how information comes about, right? I think, though, and Elon Musk recently said it, he said, look, we will put out stuff often and it'll turn out to be false, in which case we're happy to correct our position. So just have the epistemological humility to accept that sometimes you'll get it wrong.
True. No, I heard him say that. He was actually in the White House as he said it.
Exactly.
Now, the question is this, though. If putting out this information without checking its veracity in the first place, there are consequences, the risks are great. That's right. So from your side, how do you rationalize that with saying someone like this is worth the leadership position?
Because I think all politicians lie, as you said. The question is, which one is the lesser of a liar? I don't think that when I put my imprimatur in supporting a particular candidate, I think that they are interchangeable with a saint, right? I think that given these options, this is probably the better option. So given the types of values that are important to me, it is incontestable to me that Donald Trump would have been a much better choice than Kamala Harris.
All right, you're picking between those candidates, but I'm talking in a general sense with politicians.
They all lie.
I was going to say, so in the sense of Donald Trump, you see him as something of a cure. As you said in a recent essay, you wrote about his election victory saying, it's an unequivocal repudiation of the ideological parasites that have wreaked havoc on our societies.
Yes.
And if, as you also say, it took decades of assiduous indoctrination for these parasitic ideas to flourish in every nook and cranny of our institutions, we'll get onto those further. Yeah. How can 4 years of a Trump presidency turn them around? You've said it, it takes decades.
That's a fantastic question. It's actually one that I keep hammering now with people, that don't be complacent in thinking that just because Donald Trump, he came along, he's got the polio vaccine, he administers it everywhere, and polio ceases to exist. To your point, what you just mentioned, it took, depending on the parasitic idea, it's taken between 50 to 100 years for these idea pathogens to develop originally on university campuses and then to break out of the university. So it won't be sufficient to only kind of rest on our laurels to say, hey, Donald Trump is here, we've eradicated this nonsense. That's why even I've had people who say to me, so now that Donald Trump has come to power, will people even read Suicidal Empathy? I say, of course they will, because these parasitic ideas have not gone away. The reflex to be suicidally empathetic is not going to magically go away because this guy came into office for 4 years. The next president might be one that is as committed to these parasitic ideas, and off we go on the woke train. So there's much more in the fight to be had.
I want to get your perspective on this as someone who's actually a couple of years younger than me, but around the same kind of age. For me, it seemed like there was a massive change in the curve where this suddenly all became public. I don't remember these kind of debates for the last, say, 40, 45 years.
Because you weren't in academia. So it takes a while for all of these. So, for example, take shingles. The virus is within you, it's dormant, and then something will trigger it such that you might get an outbreak and I don't. But it is in there. So what you were reacting to is the fact that you didn't know that shingles was, flourishing in the background, whereas I was living in the petri dish of shingles called academia. So, and let me give you the background of how I first was exposed to, Houston, we have a problem. So my scientific work originally was in the application of evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology and studying human behavior in general and consumer behavior and economic behavior in particular. And so as I tried to Darwinize the business school, the idea being that you can't study entrepreneurship or leadership or consumer behavior or economic behavior without ever invoking our biological nature. To me, that seemed like a very banal and obvious statement. Well, apparently it was completely heretical to most of my academic colleagues. And so I was right. That was my first exposure to parasitic ideas. How could these otherwise bright, educated people be questioning the fact that human beings, consumers, are biological? You don't think our hormones affect our behavior? How? Right? And so I saw it, but it took a while for other people who were not inhabiting that ecosystem to then hit them. And that, to me, is frustrating, because had people listened when I stood up on top of the mountain and saying, we have a problem, then we wouldn't have had to have 900 medals being stolen by trans women. You see what I mean?
I hear you. Yeah.
I appeared in 2017. I appeared in front of the Canadian Senate. I was summoned, as was Jordan Peterson, separately, to talk about Bill C-16, which at the time was a bill that hadn't passed yet, trying to incorporate gender identity and gender expression under the hateful rubric umbrella. And I said, yeah, of course, I support the idea that no person should face any bigotry, but beware of the proverbial slippery slope. Now, if you go back and you listen to my warnings, I hate to say it, but they were prophetic.
How do you regard the way, well, this also occurred to me, the word political correctness came in, I don't know what, maybe 15, 20 years ago that I could really remember. And suddenly all the parameters changed. I couldn't put on an African accent, for example. I certainly couldn't, if I was an actor, go on, blacken my face and appear as an African. When that all started to emerge, how did you regard that?
I was very concerned by it, because I saw the kind of stifling environment it created in otherwise banal interactions on campuses. So people were, I remember at one point someone asked me, this was probably about 10 years ago, oh, where are you from originally? And I was about to answer. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I know that I'm not supposed to ask that. I said, what do you mean you're not supposed to ask that? You recognize that I don't look as though I'm indigenous to Canada because I have a particular morphological look. What's the problem with you asking where I come from originally? So I've noticed that for a while. I compare it, and you might remember this from the parasitic mind. The parasitic wasp stings a much bigger spider, rendering it zombified, and then it takes it to its burrow, lays its eggs on it, and then its eggs, as they hatch, eat the spider in vivo while it's alive. And so I argue that political correctness is akin to the spider wasp sting, because it stultifies me, right? I'm now afraid to say, I recognize that you don't look French Canadian. So what if I were to say, Mr. Khan, where are you from? How is that an insult? But that's what happens with political correctness. It removes our ability to have natural dynamics.
Just an aside, I tend to say, what are your roots?
What are your roots?
I find it kind of safer. And this is the issue. Aren't there so many landmines now onto which we can easily step?
Not if you're called Gad Saad. I mean, I don't give a SHIT. You know, there's a, and I invoke this in chapter 8 of the Parasitic Mind. I say, activate your inner honey badger. Right? The honey badger, for the viewers and listeners who may not know, has been literally ranked as the most ferocious and fierce animal in the animal kingdom, which is saying a lot. There are a lot of ferocious animals in the animal kingdom. The reason, it's the size of a small dog. It is so fierce that adult lions will stay clear of it, right? That's why there's the expression, honey badgers don't give an F. I live my life this way, maybe to a fault, and I wish more people would invoke
You end the
courage.
book basically saying evoke your honey badger. You know.
Exactly.
How do you regard Andrew Tate? I interviewed him at his home in Romania.
Yeah, I've never interacted with him. I don't know much about him. I mean, he seems maybe not to my aesthetic taste in terms of his delivery, like kind of the bro stuff. Some of his, and I'm hardly one who can't engage in locker room talk, right? I mean, I was literally a soccer player myself.
Yeah,
so it's not as though I'm a dainty Puritan madam, but he seems a bit too harsh for me.
He's had a lot of influence, especially on young men.
On young men, yes.
You know, in the approach to some of the things you talk about, you can't refute facts like, you know, men are physiologically stronger than women and so on. I think
Yes.
that's why I was curious in case you'd come across.
I mean, he certainly will say some things that are backed by evolutionary science, if not common sense. But I think the style of how he does it is a bit problematic. What did you think of him? Did you enjoy interacting with him?
Yeah, it was actually interesting talking with him because, again, I think he's used to people engaging him for an argument.
Yes.
And he had to stop and think when I just asked an innocent question.
Right.
So, you know, I'm going to go back to Donald Trump just for a couple more questions. Joe Rogan, someone with whom you've appeared a number of times now, has been very influential. How much do you think he played a role in tipping the scale in favor of Donald Trump? In the election?
As a matter of fact, before he had appeared with Joe Rogan, I was in touch with Trump's people about him coming on my show, which is a much smaller show than, I mean, I'm a popular guy, but I'm not Joe Rogan popular. And when they had asked me, what would be your idea of, you know, what would you want to get out of it? I said, well, you know what I'd love? Just to sit with him and to humanize him so that the people who are on the fence can actually see he's a funny guy. He's got a great sense of humor. He's a regular. He could, you know, just shoot the blank, right? Well, that's exactly what ended up happening when he went for 3 hours on Joe Rogan, which, of course, at that point, once he's done Joe Rogan, there's no point on coming on my show. He's done the biggest show. But so to your question, I think it really helped to humanize him because so often his interactions are ones where he's put on the back foot, where he's defensive, whereas here he's calm, he's relaxed. There's no gotcha stuff. With just two guys chatting, I think it probably flipped a few people who were fence sitting.
How do you feel he's done so far now, about a month into the presidency as we're talking?
I don't think, I mean, as you said, I'm a bit younger than you. I can't think of a 4-week period where a president did more stuff than this guy has done.
Is it good stuff?
Well, you tell me, is there some bad stuff? Is there some stuff?
Well, I'm asking you really because I'm essentially just taking the position of getting your perspective on this.
Yeah, so far, I haven't seen anything that has caused me great alarm. He got rid of all the Title IX stuff where biological males can enter female spaces. That's good. He's trying to cut down on, open border immigration. I think that's good. He's trying to reduce the excessive waste and corruption through DOGE. That's good. So far, I think I'm happy.
Okay, because some would say there's been some backfiring. Firing all those people, in the government who now suddenly have to be re-recruited because it's overdone. The Gaza Riviera,
that's a bit of Trump bombast. I'm not sure if I would have approached it exactly the same way. But that, again, is, I think, stylistic, right? He's a great negotiator. It could well be that he says that without literally meaning that because he's trying to angle for a better negotiation position. So I can't pretend to know what's exactly in his mind, but I can see how the optics of such a proposal could irk a lot of people the wrong way.
Now, in The Parasitic Mind, you talked about an analogy where there's an elderly woman being attacked in an alleyway.
Yes.
And you could be one of two sorts of people. The one who goes in and helps or the one who kind of walks away and avoids getting involved. And you said, be the first. You can get involved. Some might say with what's just happened, as we're talking again with the situation with Ukraine, he has now said, I'll go into Ukraine, but if we can have mineral rights. It's like, I'll help you, old lady, but as long as you give me some money from your purse.
Except, hasn't there been already a lot of the purse of the United States taxpayer given to Ukraine? So the question becomes, how far do you want to take this? I mean, how much are the American and frankly the Canadian taxpayers owing in the protection of Ukraine? If you are a strong isolationist, you'd say we've already spent way too much money. If you're a globalist, we haven't spent enough money. It depends on your perspective.
Talking of those close to the president, Elon Musk is also a fan of yours and your book.
Yes.
And he's certainly, a lot of his decisions. I wonder, do you feel that he was shaped to some degree by what you wrote in The Parasitic Mind?
Well, there is an article that came out in Wall Street Journal about 7-8 months ago. The title of the article, "The Man Who Fuels Elon Musk's Nightmares." Do you know who that man is? So I suspect, I mean, it's hard to answer that question without being immodest, but certainly I probably played a hand.
Look for that. I missed that in my research. Yeah. You said that Elon Musk should get the Nobel Prize.
I do.
In which field?
Well, we probably peace in the sense that someone will probably correct me, but I would say probably within a week of him having purchased Twitter, I did a sad truth clip where I said, of all the things that Elon Musk has done and anything that he will do in the future, none will be as historically consequential as him having bought X.
No, I remember you'd quoted that.
Exactly. And so the fact that he has freed many of us from the oversight of in French you say les bien-pensants, the good thinkers, the ones who are better, or as Thomas Sowell would say, the anointed ones. The fact that I can now go on a thing and even use the R word. You know what the R word is? Somebody says something really idiotic. I go, come on, man, are you retarded?
Oh, right, yeah.
So that was completely a no-no. I mean, the only strike I ever got on former Twitter, I think it was maybe like a 7-day violation, was because I had used the R word. Real life cannot be sanitized in this way, right? When I was in the Lebanese Civil War, I didn't know if the next minute I was going to live or not, and that was my reality growing up. You can handle the R word.
How did you find Elon Musk as a person?
So we spent a lot of time together. He actually had invited me down to meet him at his house. We ended up spending maybe about 4 hours together. I found him to be incredibly engaging, very, very humble. I mean, we had communicated many times, but that was the first time that we had seen each other in person. Zero ego, just two guys. We literally hugged, sat there for 4 hours, completely locked in, sometimes discussing some very personal and intimate things, sometimes discussing about maintaining human consciousness via interplanetary travel. So sometimes it got very, esoteric and philosophical. Other times, as a matter of fact, now I could say it because he's mentioned it himself. He told me that the original, trigger for him that got him into the woke mind virus was the reality that he faced with his own son, who became his daughter, right? At the time, I didn't know if that was public, so I never had mentioned it. But, he was confiding in me in a very trusting way, in a very intimate way. So I thought he was just absolutely lovely. I mean, he is an eccentric guy, but I've got nothing but positive affection for him.
He got some flack for doing the Roman salute, which is often compared with the Nazi salute.
No, this thing, yes.
As someone who's culturally Jewish, how did you feel about that?
Well, I said, I actually had right away tweeted, I don't know if you saw it, I said, I can't believe that I was able to spend all this time in the Grand Nazi's house, and as a Jew, I came out alive. Of course, I was mocking the idea that he is, pro-Nazi and so on. It's so silly, come on.
A lot of the stuff you write, actually, this was interesting to note, even in your book, that irony and satire gets lost on a lot of people.
Oh, my God. It's unbelievable. First, the power of irony and satire and sarcasm. So in the book, in The Parasitic Mind, I say that it is akin to the surgeon's scalpel cutting through warm butter, right? The reason why dictators go after the satirists first. They don't go after the guys with the big muscles. Those are easy to handle. But the guy who's got the sharp tongue, the guy who's got the sharp pen, hence the pen is mightier than the sword, that's the one that I'm scared of, because he's the one who could attack attack my ideology, my position, right? So he makes me scared. And so that's the reason why I use satire and sarcasm. But to your point, what amazes me is how often, usually it's somebody new who doesn't know my style, who I'll write something that is completely satirical, and then they will just start sending me endless hate mail, not realizing that I was being satirical.
With Dr. Gad Saad explaining how he believes the parasitic mind is shaping our world today. On the next episode of the conversation I had with him, I challenge his fears that Islam is a danger to the world.
Islam, though, is a set of ideas that are codified, and then we could say, does Islam promote greater personal liberties and freedoms? Yes or no. There is only these answers. It's either yes or it's no, right? I would venture that based on historical facts, it doesn't promote greater personal liberties and freedoms. And so I can't be Islamophobic in saying that. It's a nonsensical term. I am a Islamo-realist.
Plus, a look at how suicidal empathy, also the title of his next book, will drag down the world order if it's not fully resisted now. Join us for that. But in the meantime, don't forget to leave your thoughts and comments, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time. A big thank you from me and the team for watching. I'm Riz Khan. See you soon.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme, the US President Donald Trump gives Hamas what he calls a last warning. Release all remaining hostages in Gaza, or, he threatened, the people of Gaza will be dead. In a joint statement, France, Britain and Germany urge Israel to allow aid to be delivered to Gaza, describing the humanitarian situation in the enclave as catastrophic. Ukraine's defense minister says his country is working to find alternatives as Washington suspends military aid and intelligence sharing during the course of this week. And images are released of the Blue Ghost lunar lander, which touched down on the moon on Sunday. A second private US lunar lander is expected to reach the moon later on this week. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President Donald Trump has issued what he called a last warning to Hamas, telling the Palestinian group to release the remaining hostages in Gaza or, quote, there will be hell to pay. Well, President Trump also made it clear there would be repercussions for Gaza as a whole. Trump wrote, to the people of Gaza, a beautiful future awaits, but not if you hold hostages. If you do, you're dead. Well, President Trump's post came just hours after the White House confirmed that the US had entered direct talks with Hamas. Well, to date, the US has avoided direct dialogue with Hamas, which is designated by Washington as a foreign terrorist organization. Well, Trump's remarks followed on from a statement confirming that the US Special Envoy, Adam Boehler, has been given authority to engage with the group.
Well, when it comes to the negotiations that you're referring to, first of all, the special envoy who's engaged in those negotiations does have the authority to talk to anyone. Israel was consulted on this matter. And look, dialogue and talking to people around the world to do what's in the best interest of the American people is something that the president has proven is what he believes is good faith effort to do what's right for the American people.
Well, responding to President Trump's threats, civilians in Gaza have voiced concern, stating that President Trump should adopt a more neutral stance.
Trump's efforts should focus more on promoting peace and facilitating between the Palestinian factions and the Israeli army, particularly through the exchange of hostages and prisoners. He should avoid throwing threats, blame and intimidation at the people of the Gaza Strip, who are suffering and live in the woes as a result of this war.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Ambassador James Jeffrey, former Deputy National Security Advisor and former United States Special Representative for Syria Engagement, who joins us now from Virginia in the United States. Great to have you with us. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Ambassador. This latest threat or ultimatum from President Donald Trump to Hamas, do you think it's likely to change anything?
First, thanks for having me on. It's hard to say. The world, even though we had 4 years of them from 2017 on, still has to get used to Donald Trump. Presidents and other leaders normally very carefully weigh what they say for specific intent. Trump is very different. He's issuing a warning to Hamas that he wants the hostages back, particularly the 5 remaining American ones, at least one of which is alive, or he will act in some way to put more pressure on them. Whether he will carry that out or not, we don't know. We'll just have to wait and see. That's the way it is with this president.
Do you get the impression this is the president firing off a message on social media, or do you think this is part of a broader strategy?
Well, everything Donald Trump does is part of a broader strategy. He just looks at it in a less precise way than we're used to. Trump believes that Hamas has lost Gaza. He believes Gaza itself is lost. But he also thinks that getting the hostages back is a very important priority for the American family members, but also for Israelis. And so he's trying to use threats. How he'll carry them out, I'm not sure. But for the moment, he'll just throw this out and see what happens. The problem is that Hamas, if it releases all the hostages, does not have any cards to play anymore and will face an Israel that is intent on destroying it one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, the ceasefire deal that took months and months to negotiate and for all parties to agree to is only sort of just past the end of phase 1. I don't understand why it hasn't just gone into the second phase. What's happened to that ceasefire? Is it cancelled?
No, it's canceled sort of by the Israelis, but they haven't begun fighting again. They've just cut off supplies. They're sending a signal. The problem is that this ceasefire was never about a ceasefire in the Israeli withdrawal. It was about how Hamas would surrender and under which terms Gaza, because they've lost the war. And there was supposed to be negotiations, formal ones in the second phase, to work out that day after in Gaza. They never really got started, but the preliminary back and forth indicated that Hamas wanted to hang tough and basically had no intention of giving up its control over Gaza. So the Israelis were not very interested in going into a second phase, which, among other things, would mean its permanent withdrawal. So this still gets down to, does Hamas think it is lost or not? If it doesn't think it's lost and Israel, with Trump's backing, will continue fighting, then Hamas is due to get in Gaza another round of war.
And all the while, we understand the Trump administration is now in direct dialogue with Hamas. That's something that I think is without precedent. Is that something you think is to be applauded, or does that ring an alarm bell?
As a general rule, it's always good to talk to your enemies. That's one of the most important rules of diplomacy. The problem is typically, and I don't know if Trump will succumb to this, talking with one's enemies leads to Stockholm syndrome when the talking itself or your false belief that the enemy is your friend leads you to make mistakes. Whether Trump does that or not, I don't know. But talking is okay. The other thing is the guy doing the talking is the hostage negotiator. And in numerous administrations, they've been authorized, unlike others, to talk to people on the terrorist list, to terrorists themselves, and to other people we don't like the Assad regime in the last administration, in order to get people back. But these talks are including also possible ceasefire options. And as you know, the last ceasefire deal put on the table was not by the Israelis. It was by Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who said, let's just extend the phase one for another period of time. Hamas hasn't responded positively, but it's clear that more and more, be it with Ukraine or be it with Gaza, Trump is trying to take over the actual negotiation himself.
Yeah, and this is a recurrent theme throughout our program this evening. In fact, it's been a recurrent theme of the last few weeks. We've been talking a lot about, historical problems, historical wars and ideological battles. President Donald Trump is trying new techniques to fix some very long-standing issues. How do you rate his chances of success?
Hard to say. As I said, it's, first of all, presidents get to choose how they want to do things. Secondly, they're judged by whether they succeed or not. But I would note that it's not all that new. This is exactly what he did with Kim Jong-un of North Korea in 2017 through 2019. He dealt directly with him at the highest level, leader to leader. Obviously, the South Koreans were somewhat excluded, rather like the Ukrainians, rather like, to some degree, even the Israelis with the Witkoff ceasefire proposal. It's how Trump likes to do things. Trump's position, if he were here rather than me talking to you, would be, look, America is the big player. We're the one who guarantee, fill in the blank, Israel, South Korea, Ukraine security, but we have global interests. So we want these problems solved, wars ended, nuclear weapons to go away, but we want to do it on our terms because we have to consider the many other things we have cooking, including China, which is always on their mind.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Really appreciate you speaking to us, Ambassador James Jeffrey. Thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's get some more analysis, and we can speak now to Aaron David Miller, former U.S. Middle East peace negotiator, who joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, sir. President Trump has issued this warning to Hamas on social media, saying, release all the hostages or else. What's your understanding of what or else could actually entail?
Look, at the same time, President Trump is using his true social media posts to threaten Hamas. He's broken through any number of conventional barriers by engaging directly with the organization. Hamas is a foreign terrorist organization. By statute, according to American law, direct contacts and material support, among other things, are prohibited. It is and can be in the U.S. national interest for an American president or diplomat to engage with any number of bad actors. The U.S. has done it in the past. In the 1970s, CIA engaged with the PLO. Various administrations have engaged with Taliban. Even people in the Haqqani network in the service of American national interest. So he's sending very mixed signals here. That's number one. Number two, Reuters is reporting essentially that negotiations have produced a sort of positive outcome and an approach to the second phase of the negotiation. Whether or not the Israelis are being apprised of these negotiations or even are directly involved is unclear. So right now, it's a very confused picture, it seems to me. My bottom line is probably, if we're lucky, in terms of the security of the hostages and the people of Gaza, you'll get an extension of phase one. But at some point, it seems to me, the likelihood is that the Israelis will resume military pressure against Hamas, and I think the president will support them.
Yeah, because there are these 24 living hostages that we're aware of in Gaza. There are 34 others who are presumed dead. Why does President Trump think they're going to be released without adhering to this negotiation process, the roadmap for which was laid out in that deal that took months to get everyone to sign up for, and we're only at the end of phase one. Why is he not respecting that deal?
It's not a question of not respecting it. I think the reality is even the negotiators who conceived this deal, I think, were dubious in the Biden administration about whether the transition from phase one to phase two would ever occur. Phase two is not just a question of implementing the conditions in the agreement. It cuts to the core of the future of Gaza. And those questions are fundamentally unanswered. Number one, if the Israelis withdraw according to the terms of the agreement, who or what maintains security? For them, the shadow of October 7 looms very large. Number two, what about governance? Yes, the Arab Summit produced a plan, probably generated by an American consultancy, that talks about reconstruction, but it doesn't get at the issue of what happens to Hamas. Is it demilitarized? What role does it play in the governing structure of Gaza? And then, of course, you have the issue of humanitarian assistance and reconstruction aid. Who's going to pay for that, and how is it going to be implemented? None of these questions have reached the point where even if the parties implemented their respective commitments in phase two, and by the way, I don't think they will implement those conditions, the predicate has not been laid for how to deal with Gaza and to prevent its return into a free fire zone with bad governance and no sense of security for Palestinians who live there, not to mention creating prosperity for them. So
President Trump says
this is the problem.
President Trump says he's got a plan to create lots of prosperity, turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East, except it won't have any Gazan people living there by the sounds of things. They'd be forcibly relocated to neighboring countries. Do you think that plan is ever likely to see the light of day?
That plan is patently ridiculous. And it has validated the fantasies of the Israeli right. It has undermined American relations with Egypt and Jordan. And it doesn't advance the argument or the possibility of a solution. I think maybe the most charitable interpretation of that was that President Trump thought he would somehow motivate key Arab states to come up with their own plan, and he did. But the plan they've developed doesn't address the core issues that need to be addressed. And I think the lukewarm reaction by the Trump administration to what came out of the Cairo summit and the adamant opposition on the part of the Israelis suggests that that plan is going to be no more successful than President Trump's.
So where does that leave the situation if those two plans, in your view, don't really stand a chance? We need a third plan, don't we?
I mean, look, I've been around Arab-Israeli negotiations for the better part of 25 years. They tend to have two speeds, slow and slower. There's no trust between Israelis and Palestinians. There's no direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. The prospect, I was at the last serious effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict at Camp David in July of 2000. That was 25 years ago. And on the 5 core issues, borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, and end of all conflict and claims, the gaps between Arafat and Barratt were as wide as the Grand Canyon. And they've only widened since then. So if you ask for my best guess estimate, I think if you're lucky, you'll get an extension of phase one, the release of additional hostages, dead and alive, the resumption of humanitarian assistance into Gaza, an asymmetrical number of Palestinian prisoners released. But sooner or later, without parties willing to undertake ending the war, freeing the hostages, releasing, Hamas is going to demand thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails. You're not going to be able to move this conflict to where it needs to be. And that is a sad and tragic development.
I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, this is a sort of a wild card question, really. But, you know, given the state, the level of trust that exists between the Palestinians and the current administration, and I think it's fair to say the previous administration in Washington as well, I mean, is the United States ever going to be able to broker anything with regards to the future Palestinian state? Or does it just have to be another country?
No, I mean, there have been there's so much that is wrong with U.S. policy, even in the 25 years I was working the issue. But there's one politically inconvenient reality that people have to grasp. You need an Israeli and Palestinian leader who are masters of their politics, not prisoners of their ideologies. You need an Israeli and Palestinian leader who has authority, credibility, influence, and who are in agreement over a common vision of how to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you don't have those two leaders, I mean, I think the last 15 months of terror and horror and violence and death, beginning with Hamas's terror surge on October 7 and Israel's relentless punishing response in an effort to prosecute that war, which has led to the deaths of thousands of Palestinian civilians. If you don't have those two leaders, then going forward, the last 15 months is going to be the prologue, where no external actor, not the ICC, not the ICJ, not the United States, not the UN, was capable of influencing the behavior of the two primary combatants. And I know I'm speaking to Al Arabiya, but I will say this. The region's reaction to October 7 and the deaths, even if you subtract 17,000 Hamas fighters from the total of anywhere from 40 to 50,000 Palestinian deaths, the region's reaction to that tragedy that has befallen the Palestinian people, not a single Arab state did anything meaningful to either reset its relations with Israel or to bring any sort of pressure on the United States. And if the Arab states and publics, I realize most Arab publics live in authoritarian regimes and their capacity to express their views is quite limited. But if the Arab regimes themselves, including Israel's two treaty partners, Jordan and Egypt, couldn't do enough to care about the fate of Palestinians, why will the rest of the world? And that question is critically important. In addition to an Israeli-Palestinian leader, you're going to need Arab leaders to step up as well, because you're going to need a regional solution.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to wrap up. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us once again.
Thanks for having
David
me.
Miller. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Itamar Rabinovich, former Israeli ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator to Syria, who joins us now from Tel Aviv. Ambassador, it's great to have you with us once again. I'd like to start by talking about this warning issued by President Trump to Hamas. He's saying, release all the hostages or else. What's your understanding of what happens if Hamas doesn't oblige?
I think President Trump tends to be a very emotional man, oftentimes guided by emotions. He met a couple of the hostages who have been released recently from captivity, and he was very much moved by their condition and by what he heard from them about the conditions under which they were held underground, undernourished, tortured, and so forth. And he's very moved by that. I think that's kind of his emotional reaction to this.
So when he says to the people of Gaza that if you don't do what I say, essentially you'll be, quote, dead in block capital letters, what's he got in mind, do you think?
President Trump is not exactly an analyst of Middle Eastern politics, and he doesn't distinguish between Hamas and the population of Gaza. When he is incensed by what he saw, his rage is directed not just at Hamas, but at the people of Gaza who have never actually distanced themselves from Hamas. That explains this part of the statement.
He said that a part of that an extension of that comment was that Israel will be given essentially everything it needed to, quote, finish the job. I mean, hasn't Israel spent most of the time since the 7th of October doing exactly what President Trump is threatening they're now going to do?
if there is, I hope there is not a renewal of fighting and that there is no need to have a second round. But if there is one, I think it's not going to be a replay of the first one. I'm not familiar with the details of the planning, but both the political leadership and the military leadership in Israel argue that it's going to be different. So, and what other clout does Trump or anybody from the outside have over Hamas but to threaten military action, and military action not by the United States. He's determined not to involve the U.S. In military action in Gaza or to that effect elsewhere in the Middle East, and the military force that would be left to do the job would be the IDF, the Israeli army. So that's the essence of this.
Yeah, I mean, Hamas didn't sound particularly bothered by this last warning, and it was quite similar to another warning where he said there would be hell to pay. Hamas saying, everyone should stick to that ceasefire agreement that was struck in January, and we're supposed to be now into the second phase of that deal. I mean, wouldn't it be better if we did stick to that deal? What's happened to that deal?
Well, the Prime Minister Netanyahu does not want to go into the second phase because the second phase should lead to an end of the war, to Israeli retreat, which he doesn't want to do. Maybe on his own, and certainly because his extremist right-wing coalition partners threaten him that if he accepts or stays by the agreement and moves into the second phase and implements everything that's in the second phase, they would leave the coalition and the government. He would have to go to elections, which he is likely to lose, and he's determined not to do that. So maybe on his own, and probably because of this pressure, he just doesn't want to go into the second phase. There were efforts to go around the issue by suggesting that they just continue with a couple of additional phases or sub-phases of the first phase. Netanyahu has a deadline, which is March 31. March 31, they vote on the budget. The budget is an issue over which governments in Israel fall in parliament. Once he crosses that deadline, he can feel quite safe. So if he's playing for time is defined by March 31 date.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Just wondering about another development that we found out about in the last day or so. The White House confirming that direct talks are taking place with Hamas, which I think is unprecedented. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you think that's something that's likely to worry the Israeli leadership?
It is worrying because it's a form of recognition, maybe legitimization, if external powers, particularly a superpower, deals directly with a terrorist organization. It does give that organization a certain kind of legitimacy, and it's awkward for Israel. Israel does not want to see that, but the White House attitude on this is a familiar trend or strand of American pragmatism. If you don't give me results on other tracks, then I will try the direct track, and if you don't like it that much, then too bad.
I mean, the United States prescribes Hamas as being a quote, terrorist organization. Do you think it's advisable, therefore, to hold these kind of talks and engage in this kind of a way?
We have seen earlier instances of U.S. administrations finding ways of overcoming this. I remember I was personally involved in President Clinton's visit to Damascus in 1994. And the question was, how can President Clinton go to visit Damascus and President Assad, Father Assad, Hafez, when Syria is on the terrorism list? And they devised a formula that enabled the president to go to Damascus, which he did.
Just lastly, I mean, the people of Gaza must be quite confused at the moment. The Trump administration saying on the one hand, cooperate with us or you're dead, essentially, which is what this latest warning was. On the other hand, they're being told that they'll be ideally forcibly relocated to Egypt or Jordan. I mean, some pretty confusing, mixed messages coming out of Washington to Gaza. Do you think it's fair to say?
Well, mixed messages from Washington seems to be the hallmark of these current times. But I think that the idea of forcibly relocating 2.2 million people from Gaza is not treated seriously today by anyone. It's the policy of or the style of President Trump is to hit the table with a 20-ton hammer and then settle on something much more reasonable. He would tell you that I did that basically in order to get the Arab countries to deal with the reconstruction of Gaza and to help me to resolve the issue. And here they are holding a summit conference and dealing with the issue. So the people of Gaza don't really need to think about relocation, but they do need to think about how to bring an end to Hamas rule and how to proceed with reconstruction.
OK, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time. Always a pleasure speaking to you.
Sure,
Itamar
very
Rabinovich.
welcome.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Meanwhile, Israel is continuing its blockade on the Gaza Strip in a bid to pressure Hamas into agreeing to changes in the ceasefire deal. But the UK, France and Germany have criticised the move, stating that the Gaza aid freeze could violate international law. Well, in a joint statement, ministers from those three countries have called on the Israeli government to uphold its international obligations and ensure the full, rapid, safe and unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza's population. Well, this includes the provision of essential items such as medical supplies, shelter materials, water and sanitation equipment. Well, for more, we can speak now to Bob Kitchen, Vice President, Emergencies and Humanitarian Action at the International Rescue Committee, who joins us now live from Nairobi. And just for the benefit of our viewers, the International Rescue Committee works in more than 40 countries and responds to the world's worst humanitarian crises. It was founded in 1933 at the call of Albert Einstein. Thank you for joining us. First of all, aid is being blocked from entering Gaza. Just to be clear, that means that civilians could start starving to death or dying of dehydration pretty soon.
That's absolutely right. The situation is dire. As you said, there's no aid going into Gaza, and the aid that we were able to get into Gaza over the last few weeks of the ceasefire is rapidly running out. In addition to that, what supplies were able to be transported into Gaza commercially are also running out, and that's driving prices up very rapidly. In the last 48 hours, a bag of flour has gone from costing $11 to $22. So not only are supplies running out, people are being priced out from accessing what is available.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine how people can even afford to buy anything, given that the past 18 months have meant zero gainful employment for the majority of people living in Gaza.
Exactly. I mean, despite the good work that we have been able to achieve during the period of the ceasefire, we're seeing 1 in 5 people are facing crisis levels of food insecurity. So despite our best efforts, the hunger situation is getting very, very severe.
Yeah, and let's just be clear. I mean, before the blockade even started, the population of Gaza was already facing acute shortages of food, water and supplies. I mean, this just takes it to the next level, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As you say, it's not just food and water. The medical situation inside Gaza is very severe. During the ceasefire, we collectively managed to get a huge amount in, but it represented less than 1% of the pharmaceuticals that were needed by a population of 2 million. Hospitals are running out rapidly of essential drugs to keep people alive. And what's frustrating, just the IRC on its own, we have 7 tons of the most urgently needed pharmaceuticals sitting in a truck waiting to go, and we're not allowed to bring it in.
I was going to ask you, what is the situation on the border? What's happening there?
Well, the supply chain required to meet the most urgent humanitarian needs of 2 million people is long and complex. So what that looks like is hundreds of trucks, warehouses full of commodities ready to go, and they're currently stuck. We can't get them in. We do not have permission.
And in terms of stockpiles, I mean, I've only heard from UNICEF, which, for example, says it doesn't actually even keep stockpiles. It just distributes what it has when it gets it. How long do you think it will be until aid groups are down to absolutely zero?
Well, we've already heard that 80 community kitchens who are serving free food are going to need to close down in the next few days. We've heard that organizations that are responsible for distributing food have already begun cutting rations to try and make their meager supplies last. The International Rescue Committee does have some what's called RUTF, which is ready-to-eat feeding for under 5s who are facing malnutrition. We have some on hand, but it's going to be only lasting a few weeks, if that. So the time is ticking. It's very, very concerning.
And what's the IRC doing to apply pressure on the relevant parties to get the situation rectified and to start getting that aid into Gaza? Or perhaps that's not part of your remit at all?
It is our remit. I'm sure yourself and your audience understand that the politics of the situation has only become more complex in recent months with the change of administration in the US. What we're doing is we're reaching out to all policymakers around the world to say that aid cannot be used as a bargaining chip between the parties to the conflict. The collective punishment that's happening at the moment towards 2 million civilians is something it's unconscionable. The women and children who are running out of food can't get access to healthcare, and the water situation is getting worse too. This cannot be allowed to happen. So everybody needs to start talking, and the aid needs to start flowing immediately.
And what does international law say about a situation like this? I mean, essentially, food has been weaponized.
Yeah, international law is clear. The implementation of international law has been slow in the last 18 months around this conflict. The international law says that Israel, as the occupying power, has the obligation to ensure the consistent and timely delivery of aid, no matter what. So it's pretty clear that both parties to the conflict have obligations here to ensure that civilians' most urgent needs are met consistently.
What do you think the next couple of weeks have in store for Gaza? I mean, do you think we might have a return to the previous situation where there was bombardment on a daily basis? What are your thoughts as to where things go to from here?
We're very worried about the ceasefire, as the first phase of the ceasefire is coming towards finality, moving towards the second phase. We're at a fragile moment in any conflict around the world with the global politics, the fatigue within the world's attention on Gaza. I think we're at real risk of seeing that ceasefire fall over in the coming weeks. So all attention should be paid to try and keep that going. Otherwise, we will return to widespread bombardment and violence where the parties to the conflict, it's the civilians caught in the middle of those two parties to the conflict that are going to suffer the most.
Yeah, I mean, both sides signed that ceasefire deal that was negotiated by the outgoing Biden administration, the incoming Trump administration. Phase one seemed to sort of be adhered to, more or less, until the final phases. I mean, what happened to that deal?
I don't know. As an aid worker, we're most focused on making sure there's continual delivery of life-saving aid. We are buffeted by the changes in politics and the fragility of the ceasefire alongside everybody else, and we don't have a unique view on that. All I can say is that ceasefires, when they move between phases in any conflict, there's always one party to the conflict or another that thinks that there's an opportunity for renegotiation, and that makes it's super risky right now as we move between phases.
And just for the benefit of our audience who might not know the geography of Gaza and how aid gets in and out, there is obviously the Rafah crossing with Egypt, and then the other crossing points in the north, I believe, of the Gaza Strip. Are you saying that basically no aid can get through any of these border crossings, or is there a chance that perhaps one crossing might open eventually, perhaps the one on the Egyptian border?
Well, the Egyptian border is obviously controlled by the Egyptian government on their side, but it's controlled by the government of Israel before you get to Gaza itself. So they have that line of control between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. So the entire line around Gaza is completely controlled and right now is completely sealed. So none of what are essentially 2 or 3 crossing points that have been allowing aid to cross in, none of them are open for business right now. And we can only stress the urgency of as many of those crossings opening as rapidly as possible before we start seeing lives being lost as a result of this brinkmanship and renegotiation.
And just lastly, before we crossed you, we were explaining that the International Rescue Committee was founded in 1933 at the call of Albert Einstein. I mean, this is a difficult question for you to answer, I'm sure, but what do you think Albert Einstein would make of the situation we're in 90 years on?
I mean, Albert Einstein was a big mind, but he believed greatly in peace and helping those who are in most urgent need of intervention. And right now, it feels like, politics aside, it's the women and children on the ground in Gaza that are suffering. So I think his counsel would be to open the gates and let the aid go in.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Bob Kitchen at the International Rescue Committee. Thank you very much indeed. Now, France says it is providing intelligence to Ukraine after Washington suspended sharing its intelligence with Kyiv earlier on this week. The CIA Director John Ratcliffe says the United States paused intelligence sharing with Ukraine after a dramatic breakdown in relations between Kyiv and the White House. Well, US intelligence is vital for Ukraine to track Russian troop movements and select targets. Well, the United States has shared intel with Ukraine since the early stages of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Well, European leaders, including the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, have been holding talks in Brussels to discuss ramping up defence spending and reaffirming support for Ukraine. Well, their meeting comes after Trump's suspension of military aid to Kyiv fueled concerns that the EU can no longer rely on the United States. Well, according to NATO, Washington provided more than 40% of military aid to Ukraine last year. Well, today, the British government said it had struck a deal with the defence tech company to allow Ukrainian armed forces to use more advanced attack drones in the Black Sea. The Ministry of Defence said that the contracts, totalling some $38 million, will result in Anduril UK supplying drones to Ukraine. Well, the United Kingdom has already provided more than 10,000 drones to Ukraine's armed forces, which it uses to detect advances by Russian forces. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to Malcolm Nance, a former US intelligence officer who joins us from New York. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Malcolm. I mean, it's been a hugely eventful week or so on the Ukrainian sort of diplomatic front. I mean, some quite old issues here, I mean, dating back to really the Cold War, but we're seeing a brand new approach from the Trump administration. Do you think we should applaud that?
Well, you certainly shouldn't applaud that. I mean, what you're seeing is an approach from the Trump administration that goes back to Donald Trump's early days in 1988, when he was very much charmed by the Soviet Union, visited there, and then in the 2000s wanted to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, and somehow seized Russia and its dictator, Vladimir Putin, as someone to be admired. This is not just an administration change from the last 4 weeks. This is a change that is 249 years old, where America is turning away from democracy and towards authoritarianism.
So it doesn't sound like you think anything good is going to come out of this rapprochement.
No, and you know, I know a lot of people who know Donald Trump personally, have known him for decades, including his lawyer, Michael Cohen. This is not hardball as usual, going up in there and then making absolutist demands and expecting to get 50%. This benefits Russia only. And again, it goes to Trump's belief that Russia is an untapped gold mine of money, and that Ukraine, which he views through a completely unrealistic worldview that has nothing to do with the realities of the ground in Ukraine or what U.S. intelligence is telling him. Trump believes in a fantasy world that Ukraine is completely destroyed, its army is ready to collapse. Nothing further can be from the truth. And he's acting out in that way, in an extortionate mafia boss way of trying to get a lot out of Ukraine for nothing, but it all still benefits Russia.
I mean, pulling the intel on Ukraine, I mean, what are going to be the consequences of that for Ukraine on the battlefield and for this conflict as a whole?
Well, it certainly doesn't blind Ukraine completely. What it does is there are two particular areas of intelligence collection which the United States has dominance on over the rest of the world. One is strategic intelligence collected through satellites, in which the Russian battlefield, its logistics, its positions are all scrubbed by U.S. intelligence, and we get very pinpoint information about where their units are, where they're moving. Ukraine has that capacity as well. There's human intelligence in that part of the world. Their spies inside of Russia and in the occupied areas is second to none. But you cannot marry that up with the second part of intelligence, which is where those satellite units detect high-value Russian targets, and then that data is passed into the rockets of the high-mobility multiple rocket launch system by the stroke of a key, and you can get a unit that comes into place, and HIMAR rockets can be devastating it in a matter of minutes. That is going to take some working around, fusing French, German, civilian, and British intelligence to actually filling in for the United States.
Okay, so you're saying that other countries can fill that void to a certain extent, but in the meantime, is this going to mean that basically Ukraine isn't deploying or can't deploy weapons as efficiently as it would do otherwise? And does this also mean a greater risk for Ukrainian civilians?
Well, the risk for Ukrainian civilians already made itself present when Trump cut the information and broke with Ukraine. Within hours, Vladimir Putin showed his pleasure by using rockets to bombard civilian areas in the city of Kryvyi, which is Vladimir Zelensky's hometown. So they killed civilians in celebration of this. This is a brutal dictator who doesn't care one way or the other. However, the Ukrainian army is not blind. As I said, they have the capacity to send drones out to get information from civilian intelligence agencies, satellites, to contract very high quality information. The British, the French, others have satellites that will have to be retasked away from their national resources in order to fill in for the United States. So it's a short-term victory for Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin only. Ukraine is going to fight this battle. I was a member of the Ukrainian International Legion. I was in the Ukrainian army for almost a year, and I didn't have strategic intelligence coming from the United States. The top decision makers did. Our front on the battlefield, we used our eyes, our ears, and our drones, our ISR capacities, and we still killed Russians where they needed to be killed.
I mean, obviously knowing Ukraine as well as you do, and it's great to draw on your knowledge of the country and the situation on the battlefield. How do you think events these last 6 or 7 days that have been watched with amazement by people across the globe. How do you think they'll have been felt by people on the battlefield, Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefield? Do you think they'll be feeling, a drop in morale at this stage?
I maintain connections with my battalion. I help fundraise for my battalion, the International Legion Battalion. And let me tell you, they're motivated. But what they are is they're very angry at America. Look, not every piece of ammunition and equipment comes from the United States. 20% of it at the top. But, artillery tubes, various types of high caliber shells, which have advanced sensors, the multiple rocket launch system rockets, the Patriot missile system, of which Germany is giving new missiles. But the United States is shooting itself in the foot. When this war is done, when Ukraine wins, there is going to be a retooling of every army in Europe. They are using their war stocks, expending this. And what they are finding now is that you cannot trust the United States. A president who has decided he's going to support a dictator could at will cut off United States resources from an ally. And this is going to block U.S. defense completely out of Europe, as Europe is about to spend $1 trillion, nearly $1 trillion, in revitalizing their entire defense industry. The Ukrainians will persevere. Let me tell you something about Ukrainians. They will fight with sticks and rocks. And that's how it was at the beginning of this war. They have the advantage. They're beating the Russians. The Russians could, in fact, collapse in the next year. And when that victory comes, the United States is going to be out of it.
Yeah, just lastly, this is a real watershed moment, it seems, for Europe. That's what we've been hearing all week from major European capitals. Some might say a long overdue wake-up call for Europe. President Trump did warn them during his first term that they needed to get their defensive act together.
Yes, but he warned them in such a way that it was more of an extortion racket than it was actually trying to work with our allies. I've written 4 New York Times bestsellers about Donald Trump and his relationship with Russia, Vladimir Putin, and Russian intelligence. It was very easy to predict back in mid-2016 that this is the route he was going. It's just he didn't know how to get there back in his first administration. And he has taken such umbrage with Vladimir Putin. Putin got him his first impeachment, with Vladimir Zelensky. Zelensky got him his first impeachment when he wouldn't be extorted through Javelin missiles into creating a fake investigation into Joe Biden. Trump is a outrageous narcissist. And he has, as his niece, Mary Trump says, he suffers from narcissistic injury very simply. And when he does get injured, when he doesn't get his way, he throws a tantrum and then he takes revenge. Very well-known psychological factors about Trump. Vladimir Putin, ex-KGB officer, knows this also and manipulates easily Trump into believing that Russia's interest is Trump's interest and that there's some profit at the end for all of this. All this did was break a major component of the Atlantic Alliance, of which, by the way, Donald Trump did not even know in his first administration NATO was a defensive alliance. He thought it was a trade alliance. Anything that does not financially benefit him, he discards, and he is now discarding Ukraine.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it. Malcolm Nance, former U.S. intelligence officer, thanks for your time.
Pleasure.
And finally, for today's programme, the US firm Firefly Aerospace has scored its first landing on the moon with a Blue Ghost spacecraft. It touched down in the Mare Crisium Basin, which is north of the moon's equator. Well, Blue Ghost has become the second privately built vehicle to land on the moon successfully. 5 nations, amongst them China, India and Japan, have made successful landings in the past. Well, Blue Ghost is expected to study the moon's surface for a period of around 2 weeks. Well, for more, we can speak now to Dr. David Whitehouse, a space expert and author of the book The Moon, a Biography, who joins us from the south of England. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Blue Ghost images have been released. I just want to start by asking you what you made of them.
I thought they were the most spectacular images of the lunar surface sent back since the time of the Apollo astronauts. They were beautiful, they were crisp, they were sharp. Not only does it show the shadow of the Blue Ghost lander stretching out across Mare Crisium, you can see small craterlets, you can see interesting objects in the structures in the distance. It's upright, it's in the right place, it's perfectly poised to carry out the various experiments it's going to carry out. But the pictures of it on the surface, the panorama, the sunrise, and especially the landing where you saw the lunar dust spread out as it came down in the last few meters, were just spectacular. They cannot fail to inspire anybody. That lunar exploration is interesting scientifically and spectacular to watch.
Yeah, they're amazing, aren't they, those pictures? I think the resolution of photography has really helped us appreciate those kinds of pictures as well. It feels like there's a bit of a rush to the moon all of a sudden. I don't know if you think that feels like the case as well, but I mean, why do you think that is?
Well, there is a rush to the moon because it's part of a few years ago when people realized that NASA, the National Space Agency of the United States, was rather slow. And could do things, but was expensive and took a long time. And along came Elon Musk with his SpaceX, which in other spheres of launching satellites and using reusable rockets showed NASA to be cumbersome. And therefore, when actually President Trump, during his first term, looked around and said, when is America going back to the moon? And NASA said, well, we might put people on the moon in 2028. Trump said, that's too late. Get on with it and do it quicker. So not only did he inspire the American Space Agency to start their initiative to put people on the moon and bring in collaborators such as Musk and Jeff Bezos, but it started a whole new ecology of smaller companies who felt that the moon was in reach of their own company and not a space agency. And the Blue Ghost lander and the Athena lander, which is going down in just over 2 hours' time down near the South Pole, are private companies. They have received very little help from outside. They've built, they've designed, they rent their equipment, their experiments on the surface of the moon, and they're doing very well indeed, as we've seen already this week.
So you're saying that President Trump has, in some ways, presided over a new sort of golden age of space travel?
Yes, in a sense, yes, but things, as I suppose is the case with President Trump, it's not quite that simple. He certainly did kickstart the American return to the moon during his first presidency. Perhaps that's because he anticipated a second term and wanted to be a sitting president when America went back to the moon. So he did start that ball rolling. And NASA was instructed to bring on SpaceX with Elon Musk and Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos to design a system to go to the moon. However, since then, that project called Artemis has fallen behind schedule, has cost a lot more. And it's clear that the Artemis project of putting people back on the moon in just a few years' time is failing. And it may well be that during his second presidency, Trump will send Elon Musk in with his Department of Government Efficiency to trim some fat from NASA. And the project he set up, Artemis, may well be cut back quite severely. And the task of putting astronauts back on the moon may go directly to SpaceX and to Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin. So what started off as a kickstart for NASA in Trump's first term is turning to be a bit more complicated now that it's delayed and now that they're looking to make savings. But one thing is clear, America has its eyes set on the moon. Even though in the recent inauguration, speech, Trump said he wanted to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. The moon still is the most accessible and easy to explore object in the solar system.
I mean, what's up there, and what's it hoped that these lunar landers are going to bring back to planet Earth with them?
Well, there is the exploration for the exploration sense, in the sense that the moon is a relatively unchanging object that holds within its rocks and on its surface the history of the solar system and the history of the sun. So we learn a great deal about where we live and indeed about the history of the Earth by studying the surface of the moon and by understanding how it works and how it was formed. But if we want to build a moon base on the moon, and the next step is not just to go there, stay a few days and come back, but to stay for a substantial period of time, then that probably involves going to the South Pole, as this Athena lander in a few hours' time is going to do, and as other probes have done. Because in the darkness of the craters of the South Pole, there is water ice. Now, water ice is a very precious resource on the moon. Not only could you use it to have water to drink, but also it could irrigate. You could get air to breathe, oxygen to breathe. But liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, the constituent of water, are rocket fuel. So if you want a base on the moon, then many of these small companies are doing the ground truth research of getting down there, finding out what it's like, understanding the surface, finding out where the ice is, so that eventually, when they've gathered the data relatively cheaply with their small spacecraft, you can start planning to put a much larger spacecraft with people down near the South Pole.
Right, so they could sort of refuel and then go on from there to other places in the solar system, you're saying?
That's a possibility, yes.
You're quoted as saying that these lunar landings could help pave the way for Mars landings. Why is this a significant step towards Mars, do you think?
Well, it may well be that President Trump is going to pivot the American space effort from the moon towards Mars, because it fears that China might actually get boots on the moon before the Americans could. But certainly if you want to go to Mars, Mars is a completely different type of mission. It's a much longer mission, far more dangerous. We don't have the technology. But what you can do on the moon is practice. You can practice long-duration missions. You can practice living on the surface of a foreign body. Mars itself, like the moon, has ice below its surface. So when you understand how to extract ice and use it at the lunar poles, then you've developed some of the technology you would need to survive on the red planet. And there's two schools of thought with this. One is that you go to the moon to build a moon base, and for all the reasons you can do that, science, technology, inspiration, etc. The other is that you go to the moon to learn how to go further into the solar system, perhaps onto Mars. Some people think, and perhaps Trump might be thinking this, that perhaps it might be wise to actually have a big effort to go to Mars directly. And this is part of the uncertainty we've seen in not only in the space program, but in many other areas of American administration over the past few months.
How far off is a Mars landing, in your opinion?
Well, actually, the first person to walk on Mars is already among us. They're probably about 20, 25 years old, studying engineering or science, and they could come from many different countries. They're already among us. They don't know it yet. They haven't signed up, because the first trip to Mars is probably about 10 years away, 15 years away or so, the mid to the late 2030s. It'll probably be a precursor mission of actually going to Mars, flying around and not landing, because that is a very difficult thing to land on Mars. It's the most difficult landing in the solar system. And if you don't understand how your crew fared on a one-year flight to Mars, you wouldn't want to put them through the stress of what would be a great difficult task. So it may well be that the first crew to go to Mars will go there and fly around it and come back, and leave the landing for the subsequent crew, who will take advantage of all the data that's been gained from the way the first crew were able to live and survive in space. Because make no mistake about it, living and surviving on the transit between the Earth and Mars will be very difficult indeed. We don't know how to do it. We don't know how the human body responds over such long periods, and we'd have to work out the technology to protect them from the hazards of, say, solar radiation. Mars is a fascinating new world. It's a completely different world from the Moon. The Moon is airless and dry, but Mars is the first new world of the cosmos. It has canyons, it has craters, it has mountain ranges, it has deserts with shifting sand dunes, it has morning mist, it has clouds, it has moisture on the surface. It's a much more active, recognizable, colorful world than the Moon. It's just so much further away and so much more difficult to get to.
And we were saying in the introduction that lots of countries are all of a sudden interested in the Moon. I mean, obviously, there have been historically lots of other countries apart from the US interested in space travel generally. I mean, obviously, if all the countries got together and collaborated and joined forces, I mean, humankind would go much further in its quest to explore the universe. Do you think that's likely, or do you think this is going to remain quite a protected, nationalistic pursuit, exploring space?
Well, despite the intensive collaboration that takes place in space, with the European Space Agency, NASA and everything else, yes, the moon is a very special kind of prize. The Americans knew that in the 1960s when they were racing the Soviets to the moon, and they won. And they turned their back on it, if you like, and they've had various half-hearted starts to return. But now, with the resurgence of China, with its aggressive, with its very capable and steadily improving space program, China has said it wants to put its astronauts on the moon by 2030. And given the problems America's had with its Artemis program, there are indications that it's accelerating that. So America is now in a race to go to the moon. Now, you could say that China is just repeating what America did 50 years ago, but there is no substitute for being there and seeing your crew on the lunar surface. So for the first time in over 50 years, we have a serious race. China sees the moon as important for its development, its image, because when you look up at the sky and see the moon wherever you are on the Earth, they want you to think there are Chinese astronauts on the surface and they are part of the future. And combating that and dealing with that competition is part of the problem America faces with its space program at the moment.
Now, of course, the moon landings, the first ones, more than 50 years ago, 1969, a lot of people have always sort of felt that there was something not quite right about them. And I think in 1970, a poll was done that said that 30% of American respondents thought they'd been faked. That continues to this day. Do you think, these kinds of images being beamed back from the moon by the lander we were just talking about help perhaps put some of those theories to bed?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, you try and talk to the astronauts who actually went to the moon and tell them that they didn't and they were faked, and you see what sort of reaction you would get. Buzz Aldrin was once the second man on the moon, was once approached by a guy holding a Bible and said, "Put your hand on the Bible and swear you went to the moon." And Buzz Aldrin's response was to hit him on the nose. The conspiracy theories, particularly in the time of internet and social media, can spread not very rapidly, we know these days, and even when back in the 1970s there were people saying the moon landings were faked in studio hangars in Hollywood. There are always, frankly, stupid people who will deny the evidence in front of them. So yes, there are people who you could not convince them otherwise. No amount of fantastic images from space that we've seen this week, no image of an astronaut from China or America walking on the moon will convince them that that is real. But that is life. But the fact is, it's unquestionable that we walked on the moon, we explored the moon, and it was one of the greatest triumphs of human civilization. And we should be proud of it. And frankly, we should do it again.
Yeah, well, hopefully those images we've just been talking about will help people realise that perhaps the moon landings weren't fake. I just want to ask you, I mean, What made you so interested in the moon to the extent you've written about it extensively? It seems to be a great source of intrigue for you personally. Where does that come from?
Well, the moon is such a wonderful object. It's more than a ball of rock. It's been entwined with human history and psychology since we first looked up at the moon. You can't say it's a ball of rock. You can't strip it of its myth and mystery. It has an influence on us psychologically, historically, scientifically. It's a wonderful object. Now, I grew up in the industrial Midlands of England, where the streetlights were quite powerful and you couldn't see many stars. Stars were difficult to see. And I was interested in astronomy, but wherever you are, even if you're in the most light-polluted, overpopulated city, the moon is there. You can, with a pair of binoculars, look at the moon and see some incredible detail there. It's not drowned out by floodlights or by city lights. So it's accessible to everyone. And it was accessible to me. And I had to argue with my father to let me stay up to watch the first footprints on the moon, because there was no way I was not going to witness that. And it changed my life. I've never been the same since. I've never gotten over it. That's why I hope that the youngsters who see the next first footprint on the moon, the 13th person to walk on the moon in a few years' time, whatever nationality they are, will have their lives changed and want to explore the moon over the next 50 years or so, write about it, develop technology that can be used to explore the moon, and also have spin-off technologies to enrich life on Earth. The moon gives us so much. And I hope the renewed interest in the moon shows people just how exciting it is to look at the moon, even from your backyard.
OK, well, it's certainly given us plenty to talk about. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Dr. David Whitehouse, a great pleasure speaking to you. That is all we have time for on Global News Today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for a wrap of the best interviews of the week. Until then, bye-bye.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Cape Town. See what nature and culture have to offer in Cape Town. Cape Town is the second largest city in South Africa and the southernmost city of the African continent. It is home to the famous Cape of Good Hope, where you'll get a thrilling glimpse of where the Atlantic meets the Indian Ocean. The city is also known for the Castle of Good Hope, with its extensive William Fair collection of art and military memorabilia. Another iconic destination is the Robben Island, which offers visitors a first-hand experience of the imprisoned history of leaders like Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu. The prison not only holds important historic significance, it also allows for a beautiful, half-day ferry ride across the sparkling waters of South Africa. Over 20 million tourists also visit the Victoria and Alfred waterfront each year. It is known as the city's working harbor, where you can have plenty to do in terms of dining, shopping, and sightseeing. One of the 7 magnificent botanical gardens of the world, you should also have a look at the luscious and rare flora of Cape Town at the Kirtenbosch Botanical Gardens. You'll definitely come across impressive rows of rare African plants. It's a great place for botanical education. There are also a lot of marine life to see in the city. Cape Town offers a rare and up-close glimpse of these underwater animals while in their natural habitat. Table Mountain is the greatest and most popular landmark of Cape Town. It's one of the famous places in the city that features an incredibly unique and varied ecosystem. It's also suitable for leisurely walks or morning jogs, and great for hiking up to the summit. You can enjoy a hearty meal while at it, or simply take in the magnificent view. There are also many vineyards worth visiting in Cape Town. Along the endless stretch of hills and valleys are the vineyards that make the best wines in the world. Heavy with local culture are the colorful streets of Bo-Kaap. It is popular among the visitors of Cape Town, offering a lively glimpse into the culture of the Muslim descendants who created these enchanting streets.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers,